Chapter 214. What happened next was much simpler. Under Su Li's deterrence, when Tingshan lay back obediently, Su Yu obviously had a lot of words to say to him. After sending Xian Jingju away to drink alone, she ran into Wen Tingshan's room. Su Li didn't listen to the secrets of the Wanjian sect. She didn't have so much time to waste here. If she left for a long time, the affiliated school might have problems. Since she and Wen Tingshan decided to join hands to deal with the Wanjian sect, Wen Tingshan would tell her frankly when she came back. After Su Li left, Xian Jingju drank several jars of Liehua spirits excitedly and fell asleep. The whole Linli building was quiet. Only Wen Tingshan's room was still bright. Senior fellow apprentice, why did you go down the mountain? Have the rules of the sect been changed in these years? Su Yu asked cautiously. She also went down the mountain without permission, and she went down the mountain more than 10 years earlier than Wen Tingshan. If Wen Tingshan hadn't changed his appearance for a long time and was the closest senior fellow apprentice in her heart, she wouldn't have recognized him rashly and caused the Wanjian sect to continue to chase after her. Wen Tingshan shook his head. Are you still worried about the law enforcers of the Wanjian sect? Don't worry, because Su Yu was slightly happy, but Wen Tingshan smiled bitterly. The person they are chasing now is me. What? Su Yu stood up in shock and asked repeatedly, Senior fellow apprentice, you are the first senior fellow apprentice of the Wanjian sect and the future head of the Wanjian sect. Why are you like this, and you are so seriously injured? What happened? Wen Tingshan's eyes were slightly gloomy. Since the token of the head of the Wanjian sect was lost, the Wanjian sect hasn't had it for decades. When you left, the Wanjian sect was in chaos. Su Yu was silent when she heard the words. She thought of various things in the Wanjian sect. The former head of the Wanjian sect died outside. Although Wen Tingshan was the first disciple and entered the longevity realm, he was stopped by the first elder and others many times because he didn't have the token of the head of the Wanjian sect. That was what she saw before she left the sect. Later, the Wanjian sect went down the mountain to visit relatives every year. She came to Yunjing City to experience the disaster. She was seriously injured and missed the time to go back. She was regarded as a traitor who left the sect and could not go back. The great elder doesn't have much lifespan left. He's very anxious for his son to become the successor of the 10,000 Swords Pavilion. When Tingshan's eyes seemed to be blowing over the cold snow, he said, I thought that he would repent, but he sent away the second elder and the third elder, and united with other elders who supported him to attack me. Speaking of this, when Tingshan stroked Su Yu's forehead and smiled as gently as before, don't worry. It won't be chaotic for too long. When the second elder and others come back, it will be settled. Before that, as long as I can solve the pursuers, everything can be solved. Mr. Li's medical skills are superb. My injury will recover in less than half a month. That's good. Su Yu heaved a sigh of relief. Then, she seemed to have thought of something and suddenly took out an item. She smiled and said, Senior brother, look, what is this? There was a small cyan sword in Su Yu's hand. It was not made of jade or bronze. When Tingshan's pupils shrank when he saw it. He picked up the small sword in Su Yu's hand and looked at it carefully. The small sword was only the size of a thumb, but it was much heavier than an ordinary long sword. When Tingshan held his breath and exerted his strength on the small sword. In an instant, a black light that was darker than the night flashed from the sword. The stars were twinkling, like an endless starry sky. When Tingshan was excited, yes, it is the token of the head of the Wanjian sect made of cyan stone. Why do you have it? Su Yu smiled embarrassedly and her cheeks were slightly red. After I was seriously injured, my husband saved me. Later, I found that he also learned the swordsmanship of the Wanjian sect. Later, he took out this token, and I knew that he was the descendant of the head of the Wanjian sect. Jingju never wanted to be the head of the Wanjian sect, so he gave it to me. I also thought about going back to the Wanjian sect to give it to my senior fellow apprentice. But the road ahead was dangerous and I had something on my mind. Finally, it was delayed. So, Xian Jingju is the junior fellow apprentice. Wen Tingshan smiled. The last head of the Wanjian sect was surnamed Xian. It was so long ago that he almost forgot it. Senior fellow apprentice, Xian Jingju is a little reckless, but he is kind and reliable. He is worthy of a lifetime. Su Yu was 40 years old, but she looked only about 20 years old with the support of the inborn realm. Her face was red and beautiful. She said, "Senior fellow apprentice, so many years have passed. Is it time to find a sister-in-law?" It was true that she had some admiration for Wen Tingshan at that time. But with the great changes and several twists and turns, the memories of the early years in the Wanjian sect had become the beautiful memories of youth. Eldest senior fellow apprentice had entered the longevity realm. Although he looked only in his early 30s, he was actually 50 years old. If he was alone, it would be too pitiful. When Tingshan put away the token, narrowed his eyes, and smiled more softly. He said softly, "You have a sister-in-law. When I recover, I will bring her to see you." That's great. Senior fellow apprentice also found someone he likes. The sky was about to turn bright. They hadn't seen each other for more than 10 years and talked all night. Many knots in their hearts were untied and they were suddenly enlightened. After dawn, Su Li woke up from meditation and practiced all night. With the support of the medicinal materials of the Lord Rui's mansion, she refined many new auxiliary medicines. But now her cultivation was extremely close to the peak of the previous life. There were not many effective auxiliary medicines. Most of the prescriptions needed living people as the guiding drug, which was against the harmony of heaven and earth. So, she abandoned them in this life. The longevity realm, Su Li's curly eyelashes trembled slightly after the genuine energy went through a big circle. She opened a pair of starry eyes, which were full of brilliance. That was the realm that she didn't really step into in the previous life. It was said that only in the spiritual circle could she have the opportunity to step into the longevity realm. The martial arts circle and the secular world lacked the necessary factors. No matter how outstanding her talent was, it was impossible to break the barrier. If she reached the limit of the inborn realm again, she could go to the Wanjian sect with the help of Wen Tingshan. Su Li opened the door of the adytum and walked out. This thought lingered in her mind for a long time. After all, this world was a world of strength. It was said that there was a higher realm above the longevity realm. Those people were called immortals. Some of them were even powerful enough to destroy a country alone. They could fill the sea and build mountains at will. They could turn the world upside down. In such a deformed world, if she was strong enough, there was no need to build any force. She could help Ling Li destroy his enemies and even his country alone. In the face of absolute strength, all schemes and plots were useless. Unfortunately, she didn't have absolute strength. She was even on the weaker side. Therefore, she could only rely on her little tricks and seek unorthodox ways to win with difficulty. "Miss, Butler Wu is here." After washing, Mammy Li came in and whispered. Su Li put down the towel. People of the Yunj sect were sent here a few days ago. Why did Wu Bin come here today? Su Li was puzzled. She changed into her usual gauze skirt and came to the front room. When Wu Bin saw Su Li, he immediately bowed and saluted. "Miss, greetings to you." Su Li dodged and asked, "Butler Wu, get up quickly. Why do you come here today?" Wu Bin didn't notice Su Li's little movement. He raised his head and looked complicated. He said slowly, "Miss, today is the day of Zhu Yang's exile. Master asked me to ask you if you want to see it." Su Li raised her eyebrows. Time flew so fast. Zhu Yang and Su Zipei joined hands to deceive the Lord. This was an absolute felony. The Supreme Judiciary convicted Zhu Yang according to the laws of the Dahan dynasty. Zhu Yang was the mastermind. She would be sent to the frontier to build a city tower. She would either die of exhaustion or be crushed to death mercilessly in the war. Su Zipei believed Zhu Yang's slander and was greedy. She wanted to get involved in the royal power. She should have been sent to the frontier with Zhu Yang. Because of her young age, her punishment was reduced. So, she was demoted to a slave and became a slave forever. Su Li still remembered that Su Zipei's dream was to be a high and mighty miss of a rich and powerful family. Now, after several years of efforts, the result was the opposite. It was so ironic. Chapter 215. Under the protection of Wu Bin, Su Li came to the Zhongtan Street in Yunjing City. At this moment, the line of prisoners exiled from the prison of the Supreme Judiciary was very long. Both sides of the street were surrounded by people who came to watch. When Wu Bin and others arrived, they were dressed in luxurious clothes. People immediately made way for them. Such a movement attracted the attention of many prisoners. Among them, there was Zhu Yang, who still had a trace of fantasy. She didn't believe that Su Li, who always cared about her and indulged her, would not take any remedial measures this time. As long as she was willing to ask, Lord Rui would definitely agree to set her free. When she turned her head and saw Wu Bin's pale face, she subconsciously showed fear. But then she saw Su Li beside Wu Bin. Her face instantly changed into ecstasy. Then she rushed over without hesitation and shouted desperately, Li, my daughter is my mother. Hurry up and save mother. The royal guards who were responsible for guarding immediately stopped Zhu Yang, who seemed to be crazy. Zhu Yang was no match for the royal guards. Soon she was pressed to the ground by a group of royal guards. But her limbs were still struggling desperately, and she kept shouting, Li, has your conscience been eaten by dogs? Come and save me. I'm about to be crushed to death. Someone is dead. Someone is dead. Such a big movement even attracted the attention of the people around. Su Li naturally noticed it. In fact, she found Zhu Yang from the beginning and witnessed the whole process. But she pretended not to find it. Butler, go and have a look. Su Li ordered. Wu Bin looked at Wu Bin's expression worriedly. But he still walked over with people. Hu Daiden, the leader of the royal guards, saw Wu Bin and immediately saluted. But Wu Bin reached out to stop him. Hu Daiden saw Su Li behind Wu Bin. He immediately straightened up and saluted. Princess Li as well. Su Li nodded slightly and said softly, Commander Hu, you are too polite. Mrs. Zhu and I have a relationship. Can you let me talk to her for a while? As soon as Su Li said that, Wu Bin was relieved. Su Li had always forgiven Zhu Yang's mistakes without any bottom line. He was really afraid that Su Li would ask to release Zhu Yang, which would be difficult. Hu Daiden didn't think so much. He nodded with a smile and said, I will obey the princess's order. It's just that all the prisoners must leave the city before noon. Princess, please make it short. Su Li shook her head and smiled faintly. It's not 7 a.m. yet. It won't take so long. Sorry to bother you, Commander. You flatter me. Hu Daiden revealed a flattered expression, but his heart was filled with endless benefits. He thought to himself that although this princess came from a commoner's background, her etiquette was even more attentive than those young ladies from influential families. It was really incredible. Hu Daiden took his men away. Wu Bin's men were no worse than the royal guards. They were enough to protect Su Li. Zhu Yang struggled to get up. Seeing that she was surrounded by people of Lord Rui's mansion, she was full of fear and hugged Su Li's thigh tightly. She said, Li, I really know that I was wrong this time. For the sake that I picked you up and raised you up, please help me. Su Li slightly pursed her lips and bent down to gently push away Zhu Yang's hands, which were full of black mud. Then she gently turned her head and glanced at Wu Bin. Wu Bin immediately understood. He told everyone to turn their backs and not to see or listen. He also stood outside the circle of people and left the space for Su Li. Seeing that Su Li could have such great power with just a look, Zhu Yang was more hopeful. Yes. Now that Su Li was a princess, she could let him go with just a word. Su Li was silent. She squatted down and looked at Zhu Yang, who was only 1 foot away from her. She put her hand into her sleeve and took out a pot of wine and a wine cup. She slowly poured a cup of wine and sent it to Zhu Yang, who was at a loss. Li, I asked you to help me leave, not to drink. Did you hear what I said? Zhu Yang grabbed Su Li's hand with one hand, and some wine in the cup spilled out. Looking at her sleeve, which was wet by the wine, Su Li suddenly showed a charming smile. Her silvery laughter rang in Zhu Yang's ear. Mother, if you drink this cup of farewell wine personally poured by me, maybe I will be in a good mood and help you. Zhu Yang's eyes shone brightly, and she sat up straight. Li, are you serious? Of course. When did I tell a lie? Su Li's smile was as innocent as before. But Zhu Yang didn't know the meaning behind this innocent. It was not simple from the beginning. Okay, I will drink. Zhu Yang grabbed the wine cup in Su Li's hand. She was afraid that Su Li would regret, so she drank it up and looked at Su Li with hope. But she was disappointed. Su Li still did nothing but smile more happily. You lied to me. Zhu Yang angrily grabbed Su Li's neckline and stared at Su Li's calm eyes. Her eyes almost spurted fire. You are my daughter and you should listen to me. Ask your men to go away and let me go. I promise that I will never trouble you again and will never come to Yunjing City again. Li. Crack. Su Li grabbed Zhu Yang's hand with one hand and gradually exerted force. Even the sound of bones could be heard. Zhu Yang was so painful that her face was deformed and she was in a cold sweat. She never knew that Su Li, who was as thin as a paper person, had such great strength. She raised her head and caught a glimpse of Su Li's condescending eyes. She didn't know why she suddenly felt cold and stopped struggling. It turned out that Su Li was not a gentle cat that could always be needed at will. She didn't know when her momentum became terrible. It seemed that she was born in the royal family and was a proud girl surrounded by stars. Do you remember Mammy Zheng? She is missing, right? Su Li suddenly mentioned a person. Zhu Yang shivered and her face became paler with fear. Do you know where she is? Ha ha ha. Su Li chuckled and leaned to Zhu Yang's ear. She blew a gentle breath. I buried her, in the old forest outside the Desu town. Zhu Yang's body trembled uncontrollably when she heard this. She said, How is it possible? At that time, you were only 14 years old. You were short and thin like a bean sprout. Mammy Zheng was half a body taller than you. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't dare to believe that Su Li had pretended to bear hardships and bullies all the time. She deliberately showed it. Didn't that mean that he, who bullied her like a fool, was a complete and utter fool? It turned out that it was not that she had a tough life, but that she had seen everything and avoided it in a way that she could not understand. And she had foolishly thought that it was God giving her a chance to live again and again. You tried to kill me several times. Mammy Zheng, the killers of the blood refining hall, and then you joined forces with Mam Su Kui. I let you go and forgive you again and again. Do you know why? Su Li turned the wine glass in her hand. Her smile was like a devil in Zhu Yang's eyes, because I want to see what you and the third sister can do in this life. Watching you climb to the highest cliff and then throwing you down with my own hands, that feeling is the most wonderful, isn't it? Do you remember the binding pill you gave to Mammy Zheng? I remade it and gave it back to you. Enjoy the next journey. You don't have much time. Su Li stood up with a smile. The knot in her heart was untied. She was extremely relaxed at the moment. Zhu Yang's eyes were wide open, as if she saw Su Li for the first time. Such a ruthless, scheming and vicious woman, was she really Su Li? Slap. Slap. She slapped herself several times desperately. It hurt. It was not a dream. Tears immediately flowed from her bloodshot eyes. She crazily grabbed Su Li's face. She was ferocious and horrible. You are a devil. You are not a human. I am your adoptive mother. How can you be so inhumane? If I die, don't think about living a good life. I will scratch your face. Catch her. Wu Bin immediately turned around and restrained the crazy Zhu Yang. The four of them pressed Zhu Yang's limbs respectively. Zhu Yang could only lie on the ground and groan. Su Li stood up and didn't even look at her. Everything around her seemed to be far away. Chapter 216. After Zhu Yang was dragged away by the royal guards, the street returned to peace. Su Li didn't look at Zhu Yang again and went back without looking back. Wu Bin was confused. The attitude of the miss to Zhu Yang seemed to be very different from the investigation. However, Zhu Yang abused the miss since she was a child. No matter how the miss treated Zhu Yang, it was reasonable. He should be happy that Zhu Yang was punished successfully. Thinking of this, Wu Bin followed Su Li happily. After returning to the affiliated school, Wu Bin took people back. Su Li drove away Yun Yi and others who followed her. She came to the Aditum alone. In the middle of the table full of bottles and cans, there was a transparent, colorless glass bottle. Su Li came to the table and gently picked up the glass bottle. She squinted her eyes slightly. If she looked carefully in the bottle, she could see a transparent insect shadow wriggling slowly. This was the poisonous child-mother insect that she made with the blood of Zhu Yang and the fifth sister Su Yusheng. The poisonous child-mother insect had been drunk by Zhu Yang. If Zhu Yang died, the poisonous child-mother insect in the bottle would also die. At the same time, she could see the changes of Zhu Yang's body through the poisonous child-mother insect. After she refined the heart-rotting pill, it was not a poison that could kill people immediately. At least, Zhu Yang could reach the border of Dahan country alive. Fang Yuan should have set off at this time. I gave you enough opportunities. Let's see if you will show up or not, Su Li murmured to herself and rolled her eyes. The thing about Su Zipei almost failed miserably. What she saw was not the good luck of Zhu Yang and Su Zipei, but the pair of black hands behind them who constantly played tricks behind them. There must be someone behind the manipulator. Now the plan failed, but Zhu Yang and Su Zipei were not dead. If the manipulator was a cautious and ruthless person, he would definitely choose to kill them. So, there was a chance to see the real face of the manipulator. At this time, Mammy Li came in with a banknote and said helplessly, "Miss, you asked me to buy Su Zipei from the broker house. But the boss said that Su Zipei was bought yesterday." Su Li slightly raised her eyebrows. Yesterday was the day when Su Zipei was just sent to the broker house. It was absolutely strange that she was bought on the same day. Who bought it? Seeing that the miss really asked, Mammy Li came over and whispered, "The boss of the broker house didn't want to tell me at first. Later, I scared him with the name of Lord Rui's mansion. Finally, he told me that it was Wu Xiuxiu, the miss of the Wu family who bought Su Zipei." The Wu family? Su Li frowned slightly. After the Wu family was severely damaged, she hadn't heard the news of the Wu family for a long time. With Wu Xiuxiu's narrow-minded mind, it was impossible for her to hide so deeply. Her intuition told her that the person who attacked her was someone else. If she couldn't find out sooner, she would have to guard against that person at all times. However, she could more or less guess the reason why Wu Xiuxiu bought Su Zipei. Perhaps this ending was even more unacceptable for Su Zipei. "Nanny, you can go back to work." Su Li shook her head and said, "Since she has been bought, forget it. Lord Rui's mansion and the Wu family are like fire and water. It's impossible for me to get my third sister back." Mammy Li was a little relieved when she heard that. Although it was a pity that she couldn't see Su Zipei as a servant, when she thought of Wu Xiuxiu's unruly behavior, she also knew that Su Zipei's future life was absolutely not very good. At this moment, Su Zipei, who had lived in the Wu family nervously for a night and changed into maid clothes, was finally brought to Wu Xiuxiu. Wu Xiuxiu closed her eyes and half lay on the soft couch. The maid beside her carefully massaged her calf. Su Zipei walked in front of her, trembling with fear. She made a servant's salute and stammered, "Slave, slave Su Zipei pays respect to Miss Su." Wu Xiuxiu slightly opened her eyes and glanced at Su Zipei. She said lazily, "Su Zipei, are you the bitch sister? You don't look so good." Speaking of this, the maid beside her gently reminded her. Wu Xiuxiu completely opened her eyes, and the maid immediately helped her tidy up her clothes. "Oh, I forgot that Su Li and you are not related by blood. You are now a slave, so you can't have a surname. Let me think of a name for you. How about Thin Horse?" Hearing this, the maids around her couldn't help but laugh. Even Wu Xiuxiu herself laughed. Su Zipei was so ashamed and angry that she almost bit her lips to bleed. She said, "I am not Thin Horse. I just entered the broker house for one day." Skinny horse was the most insulting word for women. Some girls from poor families were bought at low prices and sold at high prices by the middlemen. After they were bought by the rich, they could be abused at will, just like how they used weak horses. Such women were called skinny horses. The more skinny horses the middlemen raised, the more money they earned. Seeing that Su Zipei dared to resist, Wu Xiuxiu looked cold and said, "I didn't let you speak. How dare you refute? Huan, teach her a lesson. You will train her in the future. Let her know what kind of person is qualified to be my servant. Yes, Miss the little maid beside Wu Shoushou responded in a low voice and walked to Su Zipei with small steps. But she didn't show any mercy. She slapped Su Zipei several times. Su Zipei's mouth was full of blood. Newcomer, you are no longer a miss from a big family. As a servant, you should act like one. Today you offended Miss. I must teach you a lesson. Ah, stop. Su Zipei screamed again and again. In a trance, she seemed to go back to 2 years ago. At that time, she asked someone to teach Su Li a lesson. Now, the tables had turned. Su Li became a princess, but she became the most humble maid. Seeing Su Zipei's miserable situation, Wu Shoushou was very happy. She couldn't torture Su Li, but she could torture the Su family. Only in this way could the hatred in her heart be relieved a little. Sister, what are you doing? All of you, stop. Wu Jin walked in and saw the scene. He stopped them. The maids stopped one after another and saluted respectfully. First Master. Brother, why are you here? Wu Shoushou's eyes were slightly bright. She quickly got up and greeted him. Her brother was busy these days. She was bored to death, so she vented her anger on Su Zipei. Unexpectedly, her brother came today. Wu Jin glanced at Su Zipei, who was beaten black and blue on the ground. He gently touched Wu Shoushou's nose and said, "You, the Wu family is not the previous Wu family. You should restrain yourself. It doesn't matter. She is Su Zipei. She is a slave. No matter how I abuse her, no one will know." Su Zipei. Wu Jin's eyes flickered slightly. Which Su Zipei? Which Su Zipei can it be? Wu Shoushou pouted and said coquettishly, "Brother, you come to see me. How can you talk like a slave? Play with me for a while." Wu Jin stared at Su Zipei, who bowed her head and cried. The sadness in his eyes disappeared immediately. He said, "Sister, it is wrong for you to do this. If you want to take revenge, I have a very special way." What way? Wu Shoushou's interest was aroused. She grabbed Wu Jin's hand and almost leaned on her brother. She said, "Brother, you are the best. You can definitely come up with the most perfect way to help me vent my anger." Wu Jin reluctantly pulled away his sister, who was very clingy. But his chuckle echoed in the room. "This time, I will let you have enough fun." In the study of the east courtyard of the Ling mansion, Ling Xian was concentrating on sorting out the files that were sent in the morning. She put the most important ones at the top. These were the things that the master had to deal with immediately today. "Master, the Dongfang family will send real seniors to control the auction on the 8th day of the 12th lunar month." Ling Li nodded and took the file. He whispered softly, "It is a good opportunity to spy on the strength of Dongfang Xiao. Let the secret department of the Sholu cult keep an eye on it." "Yes, Master." Ling Mo took the file and retreated to the side. Ling Xian took another file and gently opened it. She said, "The spy found that Tianji country and Nanjiang country both sent princes to visit. They will arrive in 3 days." Ling Li slightly raised his eyebrows and bowed his head to ponder. The Wei family of Nanjiang country had always been restless and made enemies everywhere. It was not surprising that they came to Dahan country. But it was strange that the Tantai family, which had never cared about foreign affairs, would intervene in it. Let the people of the Tianya house be prepared. Nanjiang country and Tianji country should keep an eye on them. There can be no mistakes. In addition, how about the manpower of the auction house? Ling Qinglan smiled slightly. After he recovered, he didn't need to worry about overthinking and dying of poison. When it came to conspiracies, he was much more professional than Ling Li. Chapter 217. Seeing the excitement in Ling Qinglan's eyes, Ling Li smiled slightly. For a period of time, Ling Qinglan was extremely resistant to the identity of the Enmore cult. But now, he cared about the Enmore cult more than anyone else. After all, when he just took over the banner of Qinghu of the Enmore cult, although there were many capable people in the cult, it was a mess. Under his arrangement, it became orderly. What Ling Li learned in the previous life was to be alone. He could do well in the spiritual circle alone. But if he was asked to manage a big cult, he felt restrained and restricted. Ling Qinglan learned the art of war from his father when he was a child, and he showed his talent in this aspect very early. Later, although the Yi family was destroyed early, he was secretly adopted by the Ling family. At that time, the second uncle intended to let him take charge of the military affairs and make plans for the battle. But he chose to go to the supreme judiciary. On the one hand, it was for the Enmore cult. The deeper reason was the knot of the Yi family. No one was perfect, and he was not perfect. When it came to managing a sect, he was indeed no match for Ling Qinglan. He was ashamed of this. But when it came to martial arts and people's judgment, he was much better than Ling Qinglan. In the Enmore cult Qinglan, take this. Ling Li took a file and gave it to Ling Qinglan. Ling Qinglan was slightly stunned. He took it and glanced at it. Then he quickly closed it and said calmly, "I see. I will act according to my discretion. I won't be impulsive." The content of the file was the same as that given by Mr. Li. It was all about Chen Gong's wife. But he didn't let Ling Li know that he had already got the news. Otherwise, according to Ling Li's attitude towards Su Li, he would be hostile to Mr. Li. At that time, if Mr. Li was in trouble, it would be difficult for him to deal with it. Ling Li didn't notice Ling Qinglan's abnormality. No matter how serious the matter was, Ling Qinglan could keep extremely calm, which was quite similar to Ling Mo. After Ling Qinglan and Ling Mo took their orders and left, Ling Li leaned on the wheelchair and gently rubbed his eyebrows. There were too many things to think about recently. Ling Xian cleaned up the messy files on the table and poured a cup of his favorite tea for Ling Li. It was the tea tree that Master cultivated in Dahan country in the early years. Master often said that only he could understand the taste of tea. Now, this tea tree was planted in the backyard of the Pandemonium headquarters. It was looked after by a few old farmers who were good at planting, and it produced quite a lot of tea leaves every year. Ling Li frowned and slowly opened his eyes. Looking at Ling Xian's busy figure, he was silent for a moment and suddenly said, "Ling Xian, do you have anything to hide from me?" As soon as Ling Xian said that, the warm atmosphere in the room suddenly disappeared. Ling Li's cold eyes were full of questioning. The feeling of being almost destroyed hit Ling Xian's heart directly. She was slightly sad. In the end, he still asked. If he told the truth, what would happen? She remembered that on the ship, Mr. Li's provocation made Master, who never showed his real feelings, so angry. What she did undoubtedly violated the taboo. From the beginning, she knew that she would only be farther away from Master. But Master, who she had accompanied for 10 years, was in love with someone else. When she thought of this, she couldn't help it. "Master." Ling Xian's eyes were slightly red. She lowered her head and said, "I have something to hide from you. I went out secretly these days and shouldn't delay the affairs of the cult. But recently, I heard the news of my biological parents, so Ling Li was surprised and faintly relieved. "I see. You can ask people of the Tianya house to investigate this matter. Why do you do it yourself?" Ling Xian shook her head with tears in her eyes. She whispered, "Recently, the Tianya house has been too busy. How can I delay the business? Back then, they abandoned this servant, but this servant met young Master. I don't hate them, but I don't want to see them again. I just want to take a look at them from a distance. That's enough." Ling Xian's words were sincere. Ling Li's doubt in his heart slowly faded. If Ling Xian said that she found out where her parents were, it was reasonable that she often peeped at them and didn't want to be followed by others. After all, she was the holy girl of the Enmore cult and the sacred symbol of the cult. If she showed her weakness, it would inevitably lose the prestige of the cult. "Tell Ling Mo where your parents live and let him send someone to protect them secretly. Anyway, they are your biological parents. Don't hide this kind of thing from me next time." Ling Li's voice was low and gentle. Ling Xian felt warm and gently nodded. She had already found someone to pretend to be her biological parents. Finally, she passed the test. "What is Su Li doing recently?" Ling Li said suddenly, and the timing was perfect. Ling Xian almost blurted out Su Li's activities in the past few days. But she immediately realized it and whispered, "I'm going to ask Ling Qinglan if there is any news." Seeing Ling Xian turn around and leave, the last doubt in Ling Li's eyes faded. He really didn't want to use this method to test Ling Xian. But if he didn't try, how could he rest assured? A woman's mind was the most difficult to fathom. Like Ling Shui, he had clearly handed over the Ling family to her and chose to become a mercenary to wander alone, but she still wanted to kill him. They were biological siblings. Why did she do this? He thought about the previous life and thought about it for more than 10 years in this life, but he still had no answer. Ling Xian gently closed the door and walked out of the yard. There was no one around. Finally, she couldn't help squatting down. Tears rolled down from her eyes. 8 years ago, the little girl shook the sleeves of the child and asked curiously, "Master, what kind of woman do you like?" "Well, let me think about it. She should be more gentle and less unruly. I don't want to be entangled with a moody woman in my life. Because of what you said, I picked up a small fan, learned from everyone's etiquette, and served by your side, desperately trying to become the person you said." But Su Li was clearly unruly, unreasonable, and moody. "Why did you see her in your eyes, in your heart, and in your mouth? I was clearly by your side, but you refused to look at me." Ling Xian clutched her chest and breathed softly. Something was hurting and breaking. She was unwilling to give up the result after waiting for 10 years. Child gradually changed. He never let personal feelings affect the affairs of the cult, but now because of Su Li, he almost killed Mr. Li, who was beneficial to the cult. Su Li was a scourge. Ling Xian stopped crying and slowly calmed down. She wiped the tears from her eyes and ran the genuine energy. The redness and swelling around her eyes faded away. Her face returned to normal, and a black light flashed in her eyes. In most cases, the Enmore cult was governed by the child's words. But if the decision made by the child was harmful to the cult, she could take advantage of it a lot. 3 days later, Tianji country and Nanjiang country arrived in Yunjing city on the same day as if they had discussed it. They wrote a letter to the emperor. The princes of the two countries visited on the same day. Dahan country naturally attached great importance to it. It immediately sent Hu Daden to greet them and lead them to live in the state guest building. The Zhongtan road was heavily guarded by the royal guards as in the previous 2 days. They escorted a large number of exotic teams and countless expensive exotic gifts. At the same time, intelligence agencies of countless forces in Yunjing city also took action. They collected the information of the princes of the two countries by all means. The Wei family of Nanjiang country sent the 4th prince and the 6th princess. They are Wei Yuran and Wei Zhenzhen respectively. There is only one prince in Tianji country. But the news in Tianji country is always not well informed. I don't know the specific names of the princes. After reading the files sent by Chu Lu, Su Li couldn't help but ponder. They came to the Nanjiang country at this time for friendly exchanges on the surface, but everyone knew secretly that they came for the full moon and heartstrings at the auction. Su Li didn't expect that the full moon and heartstrings could be so attractive. In the spiritual circle, the full moon and heartstrings was not so precious. In the hands of the major sects, there were many more precious treasures in the Zifu. But now, she realized that she was in the secular world after all. There were very few people in the martial arts circle who could enter the spiritual circle. Although a warrior at the peak of the inborn realm with the full moon and heartstrings was not as good as a warrior in the longevity realm, he could definitely defeat an ordinary warrior at the peak of the inborn realm within 10 move. To the various sects and family forces, it was an absolute deterrent. The Dongfang family could auction this kind of thing. Chapter 218. The next day, Dongfang Xiao, the emperor of the Dahan country, solemnly received the princes of the two countries. According to hundreds of officials, the two princes brought a lot of novel gifts. The atmosphere in the Yangshan Hall was harmonious. The emperor laughed several times and was very happy. Among them, it was worth mentioning that the mechanical man brought by the prince of the Tianji country could write automatically. Although it was just a few fixed blessings, it was enough to be amazing. The news quickly spread to all directions of Yunjing city. Su Li was in the affiliated school of the National Academy. Mammy Li also heard a lot and came back to tell the miss. But she didn't know that Su Li had already got more detailed information from Chu Lu. The trees were lush outside the house, and the sandalwood fragrance was curling up inside the house. It was really quiet. Su Li destroyed the file with one hand and narrowed her eyes slightly. She was lost in thought. In her previous life, after she achieved great cultivation, she returned to the Dahan country and focused on revenge. Except for investigating the origin of her disabled husband, she turned a deaf ear to everything else. She didn't have much contact with the Nanjiang country or the Tianji country. However, no matter whether the two princes came for the full moon and heartstrings or not, she had to find out the details of them, especially the Wei family. If she guessed right, the enemy of Fang Yuan and others was undoubtedly the Wei family. If she could, she didn't mind collecting some interest for Fang Yuan and others before the auction fair. And the Wanjian sect, Su Li rubbed her eyebrows and couldn't help but have a headache. When Tingshan learned a strange disguising skill. He could disguise others. Even warriors at the peak of the inborn realm couldn't see the clues. This brought convenience to everyone in the Leanly building. But he couldn't disguise himself. What was more exaggerated was that no disguising skill or disguising elixir could work on his face. There was a life token of Wen Tingshan in the Wanjian sect. It contained Wen Tingshan's pneuma. It could be activated by a secret method to track Wen Tingshan's whereabouts. Although the scope of the secret method was very large, Wen Tingshan couldn't disguise himself. If the Wanjian sect and the Dongfang family united, it wouldn't take long to thoroughly investigate a person in Yunjing City. She had set a tactical matrix around Wen Tingshan's room to isolate Wen Tingshan's pneuma, but it was just a temporary measure. She needed to think of another plan to solve it. After breakfast, Su Li went out of the courtyard and entered the real National Academy with the books she borrowed from the National Book Tower 2 days ago. There was only a wall between the National Academy and the affiliated school of the National Academy. No one guarded it, so there was no need to show the jade token. At this moment, it was the morning class. There was a rhythmic sound of reading mixed with the shouts of practicing martial arts. Su Li stared at it and saw that the young warriors who had just entered the school were sweating profusely in the martial arts field. She went all the way to the National Book Tower. The forest road was deserted. At this time, no one went to the National Book Tower except for the lecturers who were resting in the National Academy. The arrogant gatekeeper checked Su Li's jade token and let her in as usual. With Dongfang Rui's relationship, the entire National Book Tower was open to her. She could even read the Xiangong mental methods collected by the National Academy on the top floor at will. Dongfang Rui said that if she wanted, she could also go to the study of the Dongfang family in the Imperial Palace. The cultivation method of the Dongfang family was the real trump card of the Dongfang family. Although Su Li wanted to have a look, she had to be afraid of the power behind Dongfang Xiao. It was unwise to go there rashly. She didn't think that Dongfang Xiao would show mercy to her because of his niece after he saw through her. Just as Su Li walked into the National Book Tower, 3 people came to the tower, 2 men and 1 woman. The one who led the way was the eldest prince, Dongfang Sheng. He had a faint smile on his face and looked dignified as the eldest prince. Along the way, he chatted happily with the other 2 people. When they came to the front of the book tower, he suddenly smiled and said, "Brother Yuran, this is the holy land of our National Academy, the National Book Tower." The man who was called brother by Dongfang Sheng had a handsome face, but he exuded a feminine atmosphere. Although his smile was gentle, it always reminded people of the word viper. He looked up and down, nodded and praised, "It is really a magnificent building. Brother Sheng, can you take me and my sister in to have a look?" This person was the second prince of Nanjiang country, Wei Yuran. The charming woman with a somewhat barbaric temperament beside him was Wei Zhenzhen, Wei Yuran's sister and also the heir of the empress. Of course, Wei Yuran's attitude was very humble. Dongfang Sheng enjoyed it very much and immediately took the 2 into the National Book Tower. Dongfang Sheng was the eldest son of the Dongfang family and the most orthodox bloodline of the Dongfang family. The old man who checked the jade token did not dare to neglect them and quickly let them in. His attitude was quite different from that of treating Su Li. This performance immediately made Dongfang Sheng proud and he was more happy. If he could entertain the brother and sister of the Wei family well, he could show a satisfactory answer in front of his father. In fact, he wanted to entertain the prince of Tianji country more. After all, The prince was the one who really made his father happy. Nanjiang country was just the second one. Unfortunately, the prince disappeared as soon as he left the imperial palace. He couldn't find him for a long time. Finally, he had to settle for the second one. A group of 3 people entered the National Book Tower. Wei Zhenzhen, who walked at the back, muttered something in a very low voice. What a magnificent building! It is made of bricks and stones. It is obviously a place where the dead live. It is really unlucky. Dongfang Sheng did not hear Wei Zhenzhen's words because he stepped into the tower at this moment and saw Su Li, who was about to go upstairs. His eyes were slightly bright and he immediately caught up with her. He did not forget to shout, "Sister Li, please wait." Su Li frowned slightly. She just noticed that there was someone at the door and wanted to go upstairs to hide, but she did not expect that she was still seen. In desperation, she could only go downstairs and came to Dongfang Sheng. She saluted and said respectfully, "First Prince, Su Li." Su Li didn't wear any makeup today. She was plain and didn't look very amazing with her amazing beauty. However, her skin was fair and flawless, tender and smooth like a baby's. Her exquisite and small facial features set off an ethereal aura. Coupled with the few books in her arms, she gave off a clean and comfortable temperament. Wei Yuran looked at her for a few more times. The more he looked, the more surprised and amazed he was. How could there be such a clean woman in the world? She was like a lotus that had just emerged from the water, untainted by dust. Wei Zhenzhen subconsciously touched her face and felt jealous in her heart. Although she did not want to admit it, the woman's skin was indeed better than hers. How did she maintain her skin? She must get the method. Dongfang Sheng let out a gentle laugh and pretended to be intimate. He said, "Sister Li, you can't do that. You are 8th uncle's precious daughter and my cousin. If 8th uncle knows that you are so polite to me and I accept it calmly, he will blame me." Su Li chuckled and blinked her crystal clear eyes. "That's my fault. I don't know why you stopped me, cousin brother." Knowing that Su Li was joking, Dongfang Sheng was slightly relieved and hurriedly introduced the 3 people present to each other. However, there was always a thorn in his heart. The matter of the Hehuan sect. The paper could not cover the fire. It would be exposed one day. At that time, how would the 8th Lord treat him? Before that, if he could get Su Li's favor, he might be able to drive away the disaster in the future. This was also the reason why he stopped Su Li hurriedly after seeing her. "It turns out to be Princess Li. I am Wei Yuran of Nanjiang country. This is my sister Wei Zhenzhen. Nice to meet you." Wei Yuran smiled politely and behaved like a gentleman. "Your Highness, you are so polite." Su Li also returned the courtesy with a gentle smile. Next, Su Li was invited to tour the National Academy together. On the surface, they talked happily and the atmosphere was extremely harmonious. During the tour, Wei Zhenzhen asked Su Li about the method of skin maintenance. After Su Li helplessly said that it was natural, Wei Zhenzhen obviously didn't believe it. She rolled her eyes and no one knew what she was thinking. Wei Yuran apologized for Wei Zhenzhen repeatedly, but he didn't know that Su Li had seen through the background of the brother and sister without a trace. Wei Yuran, the acquired 9th hurdle. Wei Zhenzhen, the acquired limit. The cultivation of the brother and sister was absolutely second to none in Dahan country. Among the 3 princes that she saw in the autumn hunting, the 5th prince, Dongfang Yang, had the highest cultivation. He was in the acquired 7th hurdle. Dongfang Lang and Dongfang Sheng were both good at scheming, which delayed their practice. Their cultivation was lower than that of Dongfang Yang. They were only in the acquired 6th hurdle. The cultivation level of Nanjiang country was much higher than that of Dahan country. However, if Wei Zhenzhen got the full moon and heartstrings, it was possible for her to dominate the martial arts circle and stabilize the situation in the future. Chapter 219. It was not until the evening that the 4 people finished their tour. Seeing that Su Li was about to leave, Wei Yuran quickly stopped her and said, "It's late. It's not safe for Princess Li to leave alone. Why don't we send you off first?" Before Wei Yuran finished his words, he was interrupted by Dongfang Sheng with a smile. "Brother Yuran, don't worry. Sister Lee lives in the National Academy. It's a treasure place for cultivating talents in our Dahan country. Even people at the peak of the inborn realm may not be able to leave here alive. Sister Lee won't be in any danger. Then, Wei Yuran and Su Li both had the same idea. Dongfang Sheng's unintentional words exposed the arrangement of the Dongfang family in the National Academy. Su Li suddenly understood why Wei Yuran didn't choose the third prince or the fifth prince, but chose the stupidest first prince. Su Li excused herself and turned away. Wei Yuran looked at her back and didn't move for a long time. Dongfang Sheng couldn't help but tease, "Brother Yuran, she has gone far." Wei Yuran seemed to be awakened. He struggled and couldn't help but ask, "Brother Sheng, there's one thing I don't understand. I shouldn't inquire about it according to the etiquette, but..." Dongfang Sheng laughed. After a day, he had been coaxed by Wei Yuran. He immediately said, "Don't worry, Brother Yuran. The thing about Sister Li is not a big secret in Yunjing City. Let me explain it to you." Then, Dongfang Sheng explained the reason clearly without any concealment. "So, Princess Li is also a master of medical circle and the first genius in Yunjing City?" Wei Yuran was amazed. He didn't expect that Su Li, who was very modest all the way, had so many identities. He subconsciously looked at his sister. Wei Zhenzhen's eyes suddenly flashed with disdain and anger. How could a princess who grew up in the ordinary people compare with her? She was regarded as the first genius of Nanjiang country by her father since she was a child. She was the brightest pearl of the whole empire, but she was in the acquired 8th hurdle. How could she compete with me? Wei Zhenzhen suddenly stopped being angry, and a hint of playfulness flashed in her eyes. This time, Nanjiang country used all its power just to get the full moon and heartstrings. When she broke through the inborn realm, her lifespan would be greatly increased, and she could even become a practitioner of the longevity realm. She would be beautiful forever. 100 years later, Su Li was just an old woman with a wrinkled face, or even a pile of yellow soil. She was too immature to care so much about a dead person. The more Wei Zhenzhen thought about it, the more she felt that the future would develop like this. She raised her eyebrows and regained her arrogance. She stood still like a proud peacock and didn't look at Su Li's back anymore. Wei Yuran was shocked by his sister's sudden change. But Dongfang Sheng was still there, so it was not appropriate for him to ask. He could only wait patiently until Dongfang Sheng sent them back to the state guest house and left. Hearing his sister's amazing theory, Wei Yuran didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He touched his sister's head and said dotingly, "Zhenzhen is certainly the best. I'm just a little surprised by Su Li's clean temperament. How can a common woman with some medical skills compare with our Zhenzhen?" Wei Zhenzhen still didn't give up. She pouted and said angrily, "No. I hate Su Li very much. I don't want to see her face again. Brother, please help me." Wei Yuran quickly coaxed his sister and said that he would deal with it after the auction fair. Wei Zhenzhen also knew that the auction fair was the top priority. She didn't dare to make trouble at the moment and quietly ran to practice. She had always known that the reason why she was able to obtain the position of imperial father was not because of her imperial mother, nor was it because of her beauty. It was because of her exceptional talent for cultivation that she had displayed from the very beginning. At this moment, when Su Li returned to the affiliated school of the National Academy, she saw Mammy Li standing in front of the school in the front room with embarrassment. Mammy Li didn't know whether to go or go in. When she heard the footsteps, she turned around and saw Su Li coming back. She immediately greeted her and whispered, "Miss, there is a very strange young man in the school. No matter what I say, he doesn't leave. It seems that he can't hear me. And, it seems that the people of the Lord Rui's mansion who are guarding outside didn't find him." Su Li slightly raised her eyebrows and looked at the back of the young man in white who was carrying her in the room. She asked Mammy Li to go to work first and walked into the empty school by herself. The light suddenly dimmed. The young man in white noticed that there was someone behind him. He turned around with a smile on his face. This was a strange face that Su Li had never seen before. But Su Li recognized his identity at a glance from the pneuma he exuded when he was practicing. "Senior fellow apprentice." Su Li tried to sound him out with a smile. The young man laughed out. His voice was low and magnetic. Junior sister apprentice, you have a keen intuition. I have obviously restrained my pneuma, but I was still recognized by you at a glance. I'm really ashamed. Su Li smiled slightly. This person's cultivation was not low. He had reached the inborn fifth hurdle. But it was not enough for him to completely restrain his pneuma in front of her. Senior fellow apprentice, you come back suddenly. What's the matter? Su Li walked over and picked up the teapot on the table. She poured a cup of tea for the young man with a slight smile. The young man took it, and his eyes flashed with surprise. He thought that Su Li would definitely be a little surprised to see him, even if her reaction was not very big. But Su Li's reaction was as plain water, not to mention surprise. Su Li seemed to be a little different from what his master said. The young man shook his head slightly and got rid of distracting thoughts. He smiled warmly and said, "This time, I am ordered to come here for junior sister apprentice." Ordered? Most of them were ordered by Enchanting. Why did he come here for me? Su Li was slightly surprised and asked, "What do you mean?" The young man did not answer. Instead, he smiled and said, "Yunjing City will not be peaceful in the future. Junior sister apprentice, your cultivation is still shallow. It's better to go out less." Su Li's eyes flickered slightly. She suddenly asked, "Is it because of the auction on the 8th day of the 12th lunar month? I am afraid that you will be disappointed." Then she opened the drawer and took out a blue invitation to the Yunjing auction. The young man's pupils shrank slightly when he saw it. He asked, "Why do you have this thing?" "I am not the child in the master's words," Su Li said softly and finally took off a layer of disguise. She said, "Master asked me to live here to let me gain experience. I can think of these. If Master knows it, he will be happy." The young man looked at Su Li and fell into silence. Qixianqing asked him to go to Yunjing City for the auction and to protect his junior sister apprentice. In the master's words, his junior sister apprentice had always been an innocent, pure and kind girl next door. But when he really got in touch with her, he found that his junior sister apprentice's temperament had already been honed. She was not innocent, but scheming, which made her feel unpredictable. This kind of gap made it difficult for him to accept for a while. But what on earth did the junior sister apprentice experience in the past 6 months? The young man's eyes were slightly gloomy. He sat opposite to Su Li and drank tea quietly. He did not speak again. Many thoughts flashed through his mind. Unconsciously, the tea was drunk. The young man suddenly came to his sense and smiled warmly. He said, "I came in a hurry today, and I didn't bring any gift for you. I will come to bother you after I prepare. It's getting late. I should go." Su Li stood up to see him off. She said, "Senior fellow apprentice, it's good that you can come to see me. You don't need a gift. It's dangerous at night. Please be careful." The young man's eyes flashed and he still said with a smile, "Of course. As a senior fellow apprentice, I have the reason not to give you a gift." Then he didn't wait for Su Li to say anything. His figure melted into the darkness and quietly left. The night wind blew, and the young man flew all the way. After passing through a dark alley, he changed out of his white clothes and put on a light golden slim-fitting long robe and a white cloak. Behind him, there was an additional hunchbacked servant. The servant carefully put the luxurious golden crown on the young man and said softly, "Fourth Lord, during the time when you disappeared, people in the state guesthouse almost went crazy looking for you." The young man narrowed his eyes slightly and smiled coldly. He didn't want to answer. He was still thinking about Su Li at the moment. Although Su Li was polite just now, she didn't even ask his name. The first meeting with his junior sister apprentice was not ideal. However, he was not discouraged. As long as he figured out what happened to his junior sister apprentice in Yunjing this month, he could sort out the situation. Let's go back first. Looking at the pedestrians on the road, the young man stepped forward without taking a sedan chair. The manservant behind him immediately followed him quickly. Chapter 220. Seeing Tan Tai Yu enter the gate of the state guesthouse, Su Li, who was hiding in the dark, turned away. She didn't ask the identity of her senior fellow apprentice, because she chose to see it by herself. In fact, as she expected, her senior fellow apprentice had an extraordinary background. Thinking of the mechanism in the underground additum and the golden crown on his head, he could only be the prince of Qianji country except for Wei Yuran. He used to be the apprentice of Qi Xianqing, the royal preceptor of Dahan country, but he was the prince of Qianji country. Su Li was lost in thought. There was a lot of information. For Qi Xianqing, although the old man was really good to her and gave her a big gift after she was reborn, she had never opened her heart to Qi Xianqing. In addition to the fact that she had just been reborn and could not trust anyone, it was also because of Qi Xianqing's mysterious background. In the previous life, she had heard the news of Qi Xianqing when she was successful in cultivation. His age and origin were secrets. The longest lifespan of a warrior of the inborn realm was 200 years. He lived for more than 200 years. He broke the taboo and was not tolerated by the world. Some people said that he was not a human, so he had a long life. In this way, she was naturally vigilant to the apprentice of Qi Xianqing. If this person was ordered by Qi Xianqing to take the full moon and heartstrings, what should she do? Su Li's expression changed for a few seconds and soon calmed down. The full moon and heartstrings was of great use to her. She couldn't give it to others easily. In the following days, Su Li prepared the things for the auction in the affiliated school. Tan Tai Yu was attracted by the three princes and couldn't leave. He didn't come again. As the time of the auction approached, the atmosphere in Yunjing City became tense. More and more disputes broke out suddenly. Hu Daiden was busy for a while. Fortunately, the martial arts forces were still afraid of the Dongfang family. Otherwise, Hu Daiden would have been thrown into the moat to feed the fish with his cultivation. Chu Lu sent a lot of detailed information about the forces in Yunjing City. She had been dormant in Yunjing City for many years. In addition, Elder Dao lost his fighting power because of Su Li. He had gone back to the headquarters of the Hehuan sect. The new elder hadn't come yet. The control of the branch of the Hehuan sect naturally fell into her hands. Su Li didn't look at it again after a few glances. She didn't care about these small forces. Only a few forces could influence the result of the auction. She had to be well prepared to deal with all unknown changes. On the 5th day of the 12th lunar month, it snowed heavily in Yunjing City. The whole Yunjing City was covered with heavy snow in a blink of an eye. It was quiet between heaven and earth. Even the sound of fighting in the streets could not spread far. "Young master, be careful not to catch a cold." Ling Li stood under the eaves and stared at the sky calmly. Ling Xian put a cloak on him considerately. The master and the servant stood in the courtyard, which outlined a quiet and beautiful picture. "Is there any movement from Mr. Li?" Ling Li suddenly said and broke the silence. Ling Xian's smile froze on her face. Master asked Mr. Li, but she heard Su Li. Mr. Li's whereabouts have always been erratic. It is said that he has not appeared in the Linli building for many days. Ling Xian calmed herself down and answered. What she said was true. She had the idea of meeting with Mr. Li to seek cooperation. Unfortunately, Mr. Li had disappeared for many days. She could only restrain her thoughts and continue to wait. Ling Li's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes were gloomy. No one knew what he was thinking. In the state guest house, the forces of Qianji country and the forces of Nanjiang country each occupied half. Although they tested each other, they restrained each other. As there were only 3 days left before the auction, the restraint became more and more obvious. Fourth Lord, I found it. Another force of the Wei family in Yunjing City is in the embroidery workshop. A handsome young man who looked like a manservant ran to Tan Tai Yu and whispered in his ear. Tan Tai Yu looked indifferent and waved his hand. The handsome young man immediately retreated and closed the door. At the moment when the manservant closed the door, there was one more person in the room. Tan Tai Yu was surprised and bowed his head to salute. Master, you are here. Qi Xianqing stroked his white beard and said with a smile, How is it, you? Have you seen your junior sister apprentice? Tan Tai Yu nodded with a wry smile and told the general situation of meeting Su Li. Qi Xianqing was surprised and immediately felt more gratified. He said, the girl finally matured. I am afraid that she suffered a lot in Yunjing in the past 6 months. Master, you don't know. In fact, junior sister apprentice is the biological daughter of Dongfang Rui. Tan Tai Yu lowered his voice a lot. Qi Xianqing was slightly stunned. There was a complex expression in his eyes. He sighed. I deliberately avoided Dongfang Xiao in these years. I was afraid to have a relationship with the Dongfang family again. I didn't expect that man proposes but God disposes. Tan Tai Yu heard the words and said with a smile, Master, don't worry. Junior sister apprentice is still surnamed Su. She hasn't returned to the Dongfang family. Qi Xianqing was stunned and asked, why? Tan Tai Yu told him about his investigation. Qi Xianqing was silent. He didn't expect that Su Li experienced so many things in Yunjing in less than a year. When Qi Xianqing heard that Zhu Yang and Su Zipei were imprisoned and punished respectively, Su Li finally didn't plead for them. Qi Xianqing's eyes were wet. This girl finally lost her kind heart and learned to seek justice for herself. Now Yunjing is mixed with crooks and honest people. I just found out that there are activities of the Hehuan sect and the Lianxia cult. Not to mention that this place is the base camp of the Enmore cult. Maybe our actions are seen by them. If we want to help junior sister apprentice get the full moon and heartstrings, I am afraid. Tan Tai Yu was worried and told the purpose of this trip. He and Qi Xianqing appeared here to help Su Li get the full moon and heartstrings. Qi Xianqing was silent for a moment and said slowly in a low voice, have you ever blamed me? Tan Tai Yu suddenly raised his head and looked shocked. He said, Master, you saved my life and taught me everything. I can't repay you. How can I blame you? Qi Xianqing sighed in a low voice and said, but there can only be one successor in each generation of the Ghost Valley. The next master of the Ghost Valley is your junior sister apprentice. Although you practice the Ghost Valley meditation direction, I can't even give you the title of a formal disciple. Tan Tai Yu heard the words and suddenly smiled gently and brightly. He said, Master, why do you care about these empty titles? I don't care. There are not many things that I can grasp in my short life. I am very lucky to meet you. Since junior sister apprentice is expected to regain the glory of the Ghost Valley, I will fulfill your wish even if I have to sacrifice my life. This sentence was sincere, and even Qi Xianqing couldn't help but be moved. The heartless mentality that had been built for more than 100 years was like a smooth mirror. There was a crack and a light sound was heard. Cough, cough, cough. Qi Xianqing coughed violently and spat out black blood. Tan Tai Yu was immediately shocked and wanted to support Qi Xianqing, but he was stopped by Qi Xianqing. Tan Tai Yu said a few words that he couldn't understand. It's okay. I deserve it. It's an old problem. After breathing for a moment, Qi Xianqing calmed down and looked at Tan Tai Yu with a more complicated expression. It's my luck to meet you, in the Hongyang house. Miss Chu, I haven't seen you for many years. The coquettish voice echoed in the air. When Chu Lu saw the new elder of the Hehuan sect, she turned pale and her blood almost froze. The hierarch actually sent him out. Could Mr. Li really deal with him? Don't worry, Miss Chu. As long as I am here, no matter the Lianxia cult or the Enmore cult, they can't take the full moon and heartstrings from me. The young man, who was more coquettish than a woman, smiled and squinted. He said, that is the gift I want to give to Sister Hierarch. In the huge embroidery workshop in Yunjing City, senior embroidery artificers came and went. In the corner courtyard of the embroidery workshop, a group of people in black who knew nothing about embroidery gathered together. Remember, we are all the most loyal dogs to our master. Even if we die, we will help our master get the full moon and heartstrings. Lin Yanxing stood upright in the crowd and looked indifferent. When he heard the leader's words, his eyes flickered slightly and he looked gloomy. He was not a dog. He had been struggling at death's door for only one purpose. He had lost all his potential in exchange for a high cultivation. Revenge. He wanted all the people who had destroyed him to die without a place to be buried. The Su family and the Yang family, when I get out of trouble, you all wash your necks and wait for me. In the third prince's mansion. Dao Zisang looked solemn and looked at the Yunjing City auction house. Teacher, I have prepared everything for you. I wish you a victory. Dongfang Lang appeared behind him and saluted respectfully. Behind him, there were hundreds of expressionless corpse puppets of the inborn realm. Under the attic, 8 elders of the Lianxia cult bowed to him from a distance. This time, I must fight for a future for the Lianxia cult. In the Dongwon pavilion of the Yangxin Palace, Dongfang Xiao was lying on the bed calmly, and a large number of elite guards in black knelt down in front of him. There were about 40 or 50 of them, and each of them was at least in the inborn 5th hurdle. The whole Dongwon pavilion was trembling with the slight breathing sound when their breaths were mixed together. Reporting to Patriarch, everyone has assembled. The leader raised his head and said. He didn't call Dongfang Xiao the emperor, but the head of the family. They were the real power to maintain the Dongfang family's control of the world. Dongfang Xiao narrowed his eyes, and a cunning light flashed in his turbid eyes. He said, "Remember, your task is not to kill the enemy, but to find out the details of all the forces, especially the Enmore cult and the Linli building." These 2 forces hid too deeply. Even though he had controlled the Dahan country for more than 10 years, he not only failed to uproot the Enmore cult, but also didn't know whether the hierarch child was a man or a woman. How aggrieved he was. And Mr. Li was also mysterious. No one knew whether he was a man or a woman. His power was the most terrible. Child Li and Mr. Li, are there any connections between them? Dongfang Xiao played with the ruyi in his hand, and his eyes were cold. He said, "It is a good deal to exchange the information of these 2 people with a full moon and heartstrings." Chapter 221. The rooster crowed, and the sky shimmered. Ling Li, who was lying on the bed, suddenly opened his eyes. His cultivation method was special. He didn't need to keep the posture of meditation. He could practice even lying down or walking. "Master, get up." Ling Xian came quickly. Ling Li got dressed. Although she was the holy girl of the Enmore cult, she was willing to stay with Ling Li and take care of him. After breakfast, Ling Li sat in the wheelchair and pondered. He took the box of silver needles and hesitated for a moment. Then he sealed his tendons and meridians and became a disabled person temporarily. "Master," Ling Xian called him with a little worry. Even if the tendons and meridians were unlocked immediately, they would be blocked. If a strong enemy attacked at that time, Ling Li would be in danger. Ling Li shook his head and smiled. "It doesn't matter. You and Ling Mo can protect me. I have enough time to react." Hearing that, Ling Xian raised her pink lips and said in a low voice, "I will protect the young master." At this time, Ling Mo came in from the door with a dignified look. "Master, the carriage is ready." Ling Li propped up his body with his hands and changed his sitting posture. He waved his hand lazily and smiled evilly. "Let's go. If we are late, there will be no fun." In the yard, Ling Qinglan was already waiting in front of the carriage. Qiu Meng stood in front of the door and said worriedly, "Qinglan, take good care of your brother." She knew how dangerous the auction fair was, but she couldn't stop Ling Li from going. She could only hope that there would be no big trouble at the auction fair. Ling Qinglan smiled and nodded. "Don't worry, aunt. Even if something happens to me, I won't let brother Li be in danger." But he cursed in his heart. Even if there was danger, Ling Li's cultivation was enough to defeat those dregs. The only thing he needed to worry about was that his identity would be exposed. "Oh, mother, this is Yunjing City. There is no danger at the foot of the emperor. Qinglan, let's go. If we are late, we can't go in." Ling Li impatiently patted the wheelchair. The crown on his head, which was straightened by Qiu Meng, was crooked again. If he didn't wear luxurious clothes, he would look like a street punk. Qiu Meng was so angry that her face turned blue. She scolded, "Li, get off. You are not allowed to go today. Look at what you're wearing. How can you ruin the hair that Xiana combed for you? If you continue like this, who would be willing to marry you?" Ling Li was annoyed and hurriedly urged Ling Qinglan to leave. Fortunately, Qiu Meng just got angry and didn't really stop them. The carriage left smoothly. Looking at the direction where the carriage left, Qiu Meng sighed. What she said was true. Ling Ping didn't marry, and Ling Li couldn't marry. She and her mother didn't know when they could have grandchildren. It was really unfortunate. On the other side, Su Li walked out of the affiliated school of the National Academy and stepped on the carriage. Yun Yi, who acted as a groom, was excited. After staying dormant in Yunjing City to practice for many days, the 10 guards of Yunj could finally put their skills to use. Before 7 a.m., the Yunjing auction house was almost full of carriages. Fortunately, the auction house was originally set up around the Shunwu Square. The carriages that couldn't stop were driven there by the royal guards. Su Li had a distinguished status now, so she didn't need to go far. The carriage stopped in the small square set up by the auction house. As soon as she got off, she saw many familiar faces in the previous life. Su Li knew them, but they didn't know her. After glancing at them, Su Li didn't look at them carefully. She took out the blue invitation card. The guards on both sides immediately saluted and said, "Welcome, Your Grace." This sentence immediately attracted the attention of the people around. Unfortunately, Su Li walked so fast that they only saw Yun Yi's back. Su Li entered the auction house through a special passage. It was deserted. At this moment, most of the people were still waiting in line outside. The auction house wouldn't really open until 7 a.m. When she just stood still, a manservant greeted her and said with a smile, "Your Grace, your room is on the 3rd floor. I'll take you there." Su Li nodded slightly. When she was about to walk, she suddenly stopped and looked at another entrance of the auction house. "Oh, isn't it Child Ling without legs, the first child in Yunjing?" Ma Jintian walked forward and sneered at Ling Li maliciously. He and Ling Li were sworn enemies. It was not easy for him to see no one beside Ling Li. How could he not ridicule Ling Li? Ling Li was lying lazily on the back of the chair. When he heard the words, his ears moved. He tilted his head and squinted at Ma Jintian. He didn't show weakness and said with a smile, "I was wondering who it was. It turns out that you are the 2nd master in Yunjing City. It's a pleasure to meet you." Then, Ling Li glanced at Ma Jintian's crotch quietly. "You." Ma Jintian was immediately annoyed and sneered, "You have been a good-for-nothing for more than 10 years. You only know how to talk. Do you know why no one takes you to the VIP room?" Ling Li was peeling his nails in boredom. When he heard Ma Jintian's words, he raised his head with interest and said, "I was wondering who was so childish. As I expected, only you, the 3rd master, can do such a stupid thing." "Oh, now it should be the 2nd master, ha ha ha," Ling Li laughed happily, but Ma Jintian's face was as black as the bottom of a pot. He was the 3rd son in his family, so Ling Li gave him the ugly title of 3rd Ma. Today, Ling Li went too far. He even insulted Ma Jintian with 2nd Ma. He couldn't bear it. At this moment, 2 people came in. They were Wei Yuran and Wei Zhenzhen from Nanjiang country. Wei Yuran felt strange when he saw Ma Jintian's angry face. He had met the 3rd master of the Ma family before. He was not a person who was easily angered. Why was he so angry with the young man in the wheelchair? When Wei Yuran saw Ma Jintian also saw him. In Nanjiang country, the Ling family killed the most soldiers of Nanjiang country. Ma Jintian's eyes brightened. He hurried to greet Wei Yuran and said with a smile, "Brother Yuran, I haven't seen you for a long time. I'm so sorry to let you see my ugly behavior." Wei Yuran shook his head to show that it was okay. Then he looked at Ling Li with doubt and asked, "This is, oh, let me introduce him." Ma Jintian's eyes flashed with viciousness. He stared at Ling Li and said word by word, "Brother Yuran, you don't know. This is the 1st child in Yunjing City. He is the 3rd son of the King of North, Ling Li of the Ling family." Wei Yuran couldn't help laughing when he heard the first half of the words. Such a playboy dared to call himself the 1st child. When he heard the second half of the words, the smile on his face immediately disappeared. His eyes were full of killing intent. "Are you the descendant of the Ling family?" Ling Li didn't show weakness. He raised his eyebrows and sneered, "So what? This is the territory of Dahan country. Do you dare to kill me?" Chapter 222. Haha, they looked at each other for a moment, but it also seemed that a century had passed. Wei Yuran finally looked away, and his smile became genial and bright. Ma Jintian breathed a sigh of relief. If Wei Yuran really killed Ling Li, the consequences would be unimaginable. Fortunately, he didn't misjudge Wei Yuran's thoughts. At this time, Wei Yuran suddenly walked to Ling Li. He waved his folding fan and looked around the wheelchair. He smiled and said, "It turns out that the third son of the Lord of North has leg problems. No wonder I didn't see you on the battlefield. But everyone in the Ling family is powerful. How can there be a waste like you? I want to have a try." Speaking of this, Wei Yuran's gloomy and cold lips curled up. Suddenly, he kicked the wheelchair hard. "Brother Yuran!" Ma Jintian exclaimed, but he was happy in his heart. Someone taught Ling Li a lesson for him. This kick was the best way to vent his anger. Ling Li was frightened and held the chair tightly. But Wei Yuran was in the acquired 8th hurdle. He was so strong that he lifted Ling Li and the chair down the stairs and rolled to the middle of the auction stage. Ah! Bang! Screams echoed in the auction house. The wheelchair hit the last step heavily. The recoil force directly shook Ling Li out and he fell on the hard stone. His clothes were torn and there were several bloodstains. There was a loud bang behind him. It turned out that the wheelchair hit the stone wall of the auction stage and a wheel fell off. Hiss! Ling Li moved his body and grimaced in pain. Wei Yuran was so cruel. If he knocked his head on the middle stage, he would definitely die because he was a waste. He tried to support his upper body to sit up, but his strength couldn't be more than half of that of a normal person. In addition, his lower body was sealed by himself. He couldn't get up no matter how hard he tried. After 2 attempts, Ling Li accepted his fate and lay on the ground motionlessly like a dead dog. Ha ha! Hearing the laughter of Ma Jintian and Wei Yuran behind him, he sighed and thought, well, Wei Yuran, if you can get out of Yunjing City alive, I won't be the hierarch anymore. At this moment, Ling Li felt that the light in front of him dimmed. Someone stopped in front of him. He only saw a pair of feet. It was neither Ling Xian nor Ling Qinglan. He tried his best to raise his head to look, but found that he was suddenly being carried horizontally. Ling Li was stunned. Then he finally turned his head and saw a pair of cold black eyes. It was her. "Su Li, princess, let me do it," Yunyi couldn't help but remind her. The young miss had a noble status, so how could she be intimate with such a profligate young master? Su Li shook her head and walked to the wheelchair with Ling Li in her arms. She gently put him down. Although one of the wheels of the wheelchair was broken and the soft cloth cushion on the chair was spilled out, it could still be Saturday. Ling Li sat down. Before he sorted out his thoughts, Su Li took out a close-fitting embroidered handkerchief and wiped the dirt and blood on his hands for him. Her movements were light and skillful. It seemed that she had repeated it thousands of times. Even Ling Xian couldn't compare with her. He had been pretending to be a playboy, but his face was tense. His deep eyes just stared at Su Li's drooping eyes. It seemed that something was alive in his heart. This time, he couldn't deceive himself anymore. The hatred of the country and the country were not as important as the person in front of him. He was already the lord of a big sect. He always meant what he said and killed decisively. Why did he become timid and worried about gains and losses when it came to Su Li? He killed the enemy and slept with the beauty. He wanted all of them. Su Li looked serious and focused. In the previous life, her disabled husband was quiet and gentle most of the time, but he was depressed and crazy more than once. He fell off the simple wooden chair and lay on the ground in embarrassment. Every time, she hugged her husband like this. Regardless of the reason, she wiped his wounds quietly. "Although I am not your wife in this life, at least, let me wipe your wounds again." Ling Li suddenly, a bewildered voice interrupted their thoughts. "Li. Princess Li?" Su Li stopped her movements and raised her head. She looked a little cold. Seeing Wei Yuran approaching, she said calmly, "Second prince of Nanjiang country, this is not a gentleman's behavior. Even if the third child of the Ling family is ignorant and incompetent, you don't care about your life and bully others. It's too much." Wei Yuran was slightly stunned. He thought of Su Li's modesty and gentleness 2 days ago. She was not as strong and indifferent as she was today. However, he was taught a lesson by a woman. His good impression of Su Li faded away. He slightly lowered his eyebrows and eyes, and a kind of pressure came to Su Li. You are just a princess. How dare you give orders to the prince of a neighboring country? Yun Yi immediately stood in front of Su Li and waved his hand to disperse the pressure. He looked at Wei Yuran, his sister, and Ma Jintian coldly. In his eyes, there was only Su Li. He didn't care whether they were princes or emperors. Seeing that Su Li had a servant of the inborn realm, Wei Yuran's expression changed slightly. He restrained his breath and glanced at Ma Jintian. Then he left with his sister. At this moment, he understood that he was used by Ma Jintian. Ma Jintian smiled disapprovingly when he became enemies with Wei Yuran. What he did was an overt plot. Wei Yuran was willing to be tricked. He was scolded by Su Li, but he still blamed Ma Jintian. He was really stingy. Su Li just became a princess, but she couldn't wait to take the opportunity to show the power of the royal family. She was just a common girl. He used to think highly of this girl. It was really, thinking of this, Ma Jintian made a fist and palm salute perfunctorily. Then he left with a smile. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. He didn't want to stand here and be watched by others. Let's go. Su Li took a deep breath and was about to leave with Yun Yi. Ling Li suddenly woke up and was about to stop her. But at this time, Ling Xian ran to him in a panic. There were tears on her delicate face. Her eyes were full of worry and self-blame. She said, "Master, I'm late." Su Li glanced at Ling Xian and then left without hesitation. Only Ling Li's eyes were still fixed on her back. Ling Xian quickly took out a handkerchief to wipe Ling Li's wound. But she saw that Ling Li held a fragrant handkerchief tightly in his hand. Her face was full of concern. Whose handkerchief was it? It was her. Ling Xian suddenly raised her head and saw Su Li's back turning around the stairs. A haze flashed through her watery eyes. Su Li, you really deserve to die. When she came to the VIP room on the 3rd floor, Su Li looked up at the nameplate of the Lord Rui's mansion. She narrowed her eyes and walked in. The auction house was the property of the Dongfang family. Dongfang Rui's room could only be described as luxurious. All the furniture and decorations were valuable. Under the whole transparent wall polished by colored glass, there were 2 benches paved with animal skin. Su Li sat on them and felt soft. The servants of the Lord Rui's mansion lined up behind her. As long as Su Li gave any order, they would immediately do it. All except Yun Yi, go out. Su Li said faintly. Everyone immediately responded respectfully and left with light steps. Yun Yi looked at Su Li's perfect side face. A trace of tenderness flashed through his drooping eyes. It was a good thing that the master trusted him and was close to him. There were melons and fruits offered by small countries on the table. Su Li picked them up and tasted them. Then she put them down again and picked up the auction list beside the fruit plate. She could see the auction order clearly. Su Li glanced at the bottom and saw the 4 words full moon and heartstrings. She looked indifferent. Then she glanced at other auction items and gently put down the list. She thought for a while. Dongfang Rui was from the auction house, so he naturally couldn't participate in the auction. But Su Li, whose surname was Su, could take advantage of a loophole and come to the auction. Dongfang Rui had been dormant for years. He accumulated a huge amount of wealth by relying on the auction house and the restaurant industry. This time, he gave all of it to her for her to squander. However, even if the money could buy the full moon and heartstrings, she would never buy it. Today, whoever bought the full moon and heartstrings would be the target of public criticism. If she wanted this treasure, she had to consider whether her strength could withstand the storm. The Linli family was small and couldn't be exposed in front of others. The identity of the Lord Rui's mansion was sensitive. She couldn't rely on either of them. But even so, she still regarded the full moon and heartstrings as the treasure in her pocket. A divine light flashed in Su Li's eyes. The water in Yunjing City was just beginning to be muddy. She could still fish. In the VIP room of the Ling family, Ling Li wiped the blood on his arm with Ling Xian's handkerchief. Su Li's handkerchief had been put away by him. He was reluctant to wipe it. Ling Qinglan's face was gloomy. Ma Jintian and Wei Yuran dared to fight in the auction house. They were really audacious. How about the investigation of the forces of the Nanjiang country? Looking at the guests from all sides who came to the auction house one after another, Ling Li narrowed his eyes. Ling Xian nodded with a little worry. She hesitated for a while and said, "But if we fight, we will inevitably expose our forces to the royal family." "Master," Ling Li waved his hand to interrupt Ling Xian. He whispered with a smile, "How can I give the old thing Dongfang Xiao a chance? I'd better learn from Mr. Li this time. The Lijue pill of the Lianxia cult is also annoying." Ling Qinglan's eyes flashed. He understood the meaning of Ling Li's words. He smiled and said, "I'll arrange it." Ling Li nodded slightly, but then shook his head and said, "It's not urgent. After the auction house, the most urgent thing is the full moon and heartstrings. Up until now, your life has been borrowed." Hearing that, Ling Qinglan sat down again. His eyes were calm. Ling Li was right. He had to settle the score with the Lianxia cult. The favor of Su Li and Mr. Li was more important. Even if everyone in the world coveted the full moon and heartstrings, he must try his best to get this treasure. Ling Xian, who stood beside them, slightly flashed her eyes and said softly, "We have already arranged people. No matter who finally wins the full moon and heartstrings, this treasure will fall into our hands through the auction house." Ling Qinglan shook his head and said, "Don't look down upon the people in the world. There are too many forces participating this time. Although the Hehuan sect and the Lianxia cult were fooled by Mr. Li before, they were still the ninth-grade sects on the same level as the Enmore cult. If they looked down upon them, they would only suffer losses. Tell Ling Mo to be careful." Ling Li ordered with his eyes gloomy. As soon as he finished speaking, a heavy bell rang in the auction house. Dang dang dang. Chapter 223. After the bell rang, the ordinary seats were full. The ordinary warriors whispered to each other, and it was as noisy as a vegetable market. The ordinary seats didn't need any identity and only needed to pay 1,000 taels of silver as the admission fee. The entire auction house could accommodate tens of thousands of people to bid at the same time. Even if nothing was sold in this auction, they would make a lot of money. Suddenly, the whole hall was quiet. A well-combed old man in a splendid robe walked out from the back hall of the auction house. Many people's eyes flashed when they saw him. He was Eunuch Feng, a servant of Dongfang Xiao. He presided over the auction house, which was enough to prove that the royal family attached great importance to this auction house. Eunuch Feng served Dongfang Xiao all year round, so he was not nervous about a mere auction house. He walked to the high platform and cupped his hands to all directions. "Today, I preside over today's auction house as the steward of the Dongfang family. I hope that all the people in the martial arts circle will give me some face and don't make trouble at the auction house. Otherwise, it will be regarded as a provocation to the Dongfang family." As soon as he said that, many warriors with different ideas were slightly shocked. The royal family of the Dahan country was so domineering this time. Some people understood that Eunuch Feng meant that whatever happened after the auction house had nothing to do with the Dongfang family. As long as the people of the Dongfang family were not offended, they could do whatever they wanted. It's a bit interesting. In the inconspicuous VIP room on the second floor, the coquettish young man touched his blood-red lips with his fingertips and looked at the light black curtain wall diagonally opposite. His blood-red eyes flashed. Dao Zisang seemed to feel something and frowned to look downstairs. But he couldn't see the scene inside because of the glass curtain wall. There were many seniors hiding in the auction house. If he rashly released his psychic awareness, he would be stupid. Find out which force belongs to that VIP room. Dao Zisang gave the order. Immediately, someone left the VIP room silently. The 8 elders around him also looked tense. Although their cultivation was much higher than Dao Zisang's, they were led by him. Dao Zisang gave up his identity and lurked in the Dahan country for many years for the Lianxia cult. They were convinced by such a person. Ahem, as Eunuch Feng coughed slightly, the noise faded away. Many people focused on the high platform again. The auction officially begins. Before he finished his words, a manservant immediately put down a tray covered with a red cloth on the high platform. Eunuch Feng didn't talk nonsense. He lifted the white cloth with one hand and showed a long sword that emitted a faint cold air. The first one is the last sword forged by Master Sure 100 years ago, the Cold Wind Sword. The starting price is 100,000 taels of silver, and each increment must not be lower than 1,000 taels of silver. As soon as this item appeared, the hall on the first floor was in an uproar. What? This is Master Sure's last work. This item is extremely valuable. Even if it's useless, it's still worth 1,000,000 taels of silver. Shallow. Every weapon refined by Master Sure is a rare treasure. One look at this Hanfeng sword and you can tell that the body of the sword is made of 10,000-year-old cold iron, which is not inferior to the spiritual sword. It's more than 1,000,000. I bid 500,000 taels. 1,000,000 taels. 5,000,000 silver taels. 10 million. The price rose rapidly. Such a treasure at the beginning really aroused the enthusiasm of all ordinary warriors. Without the warm-up, the atmosphere of the auction was directly raised to the highest level. Not long after, the VIP rooms on the second floor also began to bid, but the third floor was quiet, without the slightest sound. Just the work of a dead master refiner was not enough to attract their attention. Of course, if Master Sure was still alive, the price of this work would be completely different. Bang, 30 million taels of silver, the third time. Congratulations to the guest number 22. The Cold Wind Sword is yours. Please wait for a moment. A supervisor of the auction house will go to complete the transaction with you alone. In the number 22 room, Tan Tai Yu, who changed his appearance, sighed slightly. Enchanting couldn't help but feel strange. Why do you buy this sword? There were many skilled craftsmen in Tianji country. Although this kind of sword was acceptable, it was only worth a base price of 100,000 taels in Tianji country. In his eyes, Tan Tai Yu's behavior was undoubtedly a waste. Even if he had money, he couldn't spend it like this. Tan Tai Yu said with a smile, "Last time I went to see Junior Sister Apprentice, it was too abrupt. I have been thinking about what gift to give to Junior Sister Apprentice. When I saw this sword, I remembered that Junior Sister Apprentice seemed to lack a good weapon. The road to Tianji country is far away. I can't go back to Tianji country to save money, right? You brat," Enchanting scolded with a smile, but he was gratified in his heart. Even if he was gone in the future, he believed that Tan Tai Yu could protect Su Li and let her grow up to be the head of the Ghost Valley who could take charge independently. Su Li on the third floor didn't know that Enchanting was with Tan Tai Yu in the VIP room downstairs. At this moment, she closed her eyes to rest and waited for the arrival of the last moment like other forces. As an old industry, Yunjing Auction House was very sophisticated. The order of the auction items was very delicate. The Cold Wind Sword was sold at a high price of 30 million taels of silver. After the atmosphere was heated up, the following auction items were not eye-catching, but they were also sold at a good price. The auction was very fast. In less than half a day, more than half of the hundreds of auction items were sold. The 55th auction item is a jar of raw Liehua spirits of the Linli building. The starting price is 5 million taels of silver. A manservant brought a small pot of wine and put it in front of Eunuch Feng. The audience was surprised and doubtful. What kind of wine is the Liehua spirits? What kind of wine can sell for 5 million taels of silver? Is the Yunjing auction house cheated? I have heard of the Linli building. It is a restaurant opened by Mr. Li. If it is true, the Liehua spirits must be extraordinary. The crowd whispered. When someone heard this, his disdainful and doubtful expression immediately became surprised. Is Mr. Li comparable to Enchanting? It should be the wine brewed by him. The crowd burst into a loud discussion. When Enchanting heard it, he couldn't help but feel strange. Mr. Li. He had lived for more than 200 years, but he had never heard of such a person. Eunuch Feng pressed his hands with a smile and said, "Don't be impatient, everyone. Yunjing Auction House has always been honest in doing business. It is reasonable that the raw Liehua spirits can be sold for 5 million taels of silver. After the appraiser of the auction house appraised it, we found that it is not only a rare wine in the world, but also has the effect of dispelling the cold poison." Speaking of this, Eunuch Feng paused and said, "However, the Liehua spirits are not completely without drawbacks. The raw liquor is too strong and is not suitable for ordinary people. Only warriors whose cultivation reaches the inborn realm can bear the strength of the liquor. Otherwise, they are easily drunk. As soon as he said that, the warriors in the hall were all in an uproar. The cold poison was one of the strange poisons in the world. Chapter 224. After diluting a jar of the primal wine 100 times, it can be used by ordinary warriors to keep out the cold. After diluting it 10,000 times, even ordinary people can drink it. The starting price of this wine is 5 million. This auction house thinks that there is nothing wrong with it. Eunuch Feng smiled and said the last sentence. I bid 6 million. The atmosphere froze for a moment, and immediately, someone began to bid wildly. The cold poison was not rare. It was very common for warriors living in the north. Every year, countless people died because of the cold air in the north. If the Leanly building opened in the north, it would definitely become the most popular restaurant in the north. 7 million, 8 million, 10 million. The price rose rapidly. Most of these people were martial artist merchants, and they could see ample profits from the fiery wine. If they could obtain this item and sell it to the north, they would definitely be able to make a fortune. In the end, the raw liquor of the Liehua spirits was bought by a warrior businessman who often traveled to various countries at a high price of 15 million. The businessman who didn't get it was not discouraged and began to inquire about the location of the Leanly building. It was believed that after today, the reputation of the Liehua spirits would be completely known. If Su Li did things in the name of the Leanly building, it would be much more convenient. In the VIP room of the Ling family, Ling Li's eyes flickered when he saw the Liehua wine. Did the Leanly building finally announce its existence to the world? As the sun gradually set, night fell, and the auction also came to an end. There were only a few items left, and the bidding became more and more intense. Almost all the people in the VIP rooms were bidding, and the cultivators in the main hall were short of money, so they could only watch the show. The next item is the second last item of this auction, a Qishan lotus. After shouting for a whole day, Eunuch Feng's voice was still sharp and loud. I don't need to say more about the effect of this thing. The starting price is 50 million taels of silver. Now, let the gold price begin. As soon as these words came out, all the martial artists in the hall went into an uproar. The noise almost overturned the roof of the auction house. Qishan Sky Lotus, there's actually such a thing. Is the Dongfang family stupid? Why would they auction this item? I bid 60 million. You want to obtain such a treasure with just 60 million? Are you trying to send a beggar away? I bid 80 million. My Luo Lei sect wants this item. 10 million gold taels. 10 million taels of gold was equivalent to 100 million taels of silver. When the rogue cultivators heard such a price, they were all horrified. They would never be able to earn so much money in their lifetime. Before the person in the VIP room finished speaking, a sneer came from the VIP room opposite the Luo Lei sect. What is the Luo Lei sect? I've never even heard of it. My Flying Star sect is willing to offer 20 million taels of gold. Don't be so arrogant. The Luo Lei sect offers 25 million gold taels. The people in the VIP rooms on the second floor were bidding crazily, causing all the martial artists in the hall to be dumbfounded. This was only the second last auction item, but the final price had already far exceeded their expectations. To be able to witness such a scene, it could be said that this trip was not in vain. The VIP rooms on the third floor and a few VIP rooms on the second floor were still quiet. They were not in a rush to bid. Su Li carefully looked at the jade-like pink lotus on the tray. It seemed that it had just been picked and was still delicate. She was very surprised. In the future, the value of this thing was no less than that of the full moon and heartstrings, or even more. Miss, Yunyi couldn't help but remind her, this Qishan lotus has 24 petals. Each petal can make the acquired warrior break through the limit and realize the inborn realm. It is a rare treasure to cultivate the force at that time. Don't miss it. Recently, Miss sent them a lot of auxiliary medicine for practice. The practice of people in the Yunj sect progressed rapidly. They were all shocked by Su Li's medical skills, which could even assist the practice. Yunyi was quick-witted. He knew that Su Li wanted to cultivate the Yunj sect deeply. Naturally, he was very attentive. Su Li nodded with a smile flashing in her eyes. She didn't refute and said, "Then you bid and buy it." Yes. Yunyi was refreshed and immediately began to bid, 35 million gold taels. Lord Rui's mansion had been in charge of various forces for many years. They had plenty of gold. It was not a problem to buy the entire Yunjing city auction house. The VIP room on the third floor bids. "That is Princess Li, isn't it against the rules?" Someone questioned angrily. "That is Lord Rui's daughter. Although she is called Princess, she has not entered the Dongfang family. Her surname is Su, and she doesn't violate the rules." "I see." There was a lot of discussion in the crowd. Many forces who just came to Yunjing didn't know Su Li's identity. At this moment, they inquired a little and were disdainful. A little princess who had not entered the Dongfang family was not worth being afraid of. The VIP room number 21 bids 40 million gold taels. The VIP room number 11 bids 60 million gold taels. Many big forces were interested in the Chishan Lotus. Yunyi's bid was soon overshadowed. This time, he didn't bid rashly, but calmly waited for the last moment. Su Li smiled slightly. If the Chishan Lotus only had the effect that Yunyi said, she certainly wouldn't let Yunyi bid. After all, AO sword skills could also be used to break through the inborn hurdle. As long as one's comprehension was good enough, he could understand the first 3 levels of AO sword skills in less than 3 years, break through the bottleneck, consolidate the foundation, and master the terrible sword skills. It could be said to kill many birds with one stone. Compared with it, the Chishan Lotus was much inferior. If it was more than 10 years later, the price of the Chishan Lotus would not be so low. At least, it would be dozens of times more expensive, and there would be no market for it. If she remembered correctly, in another 2 years, a relic would appear in Nanjiang country. It was a mansion left by a mighty figure in the real spiritual circle, and it was a mighty figure in the medical circle. Countless extinct prescriptions would reappear, including the life-prolonging pill. The life pill here was not healing, but prolonging life. Every life pill could go against nature and prolong life by 50 years. At that time, the prescription was taken away by Yu Ming, the medicine emperor of the spiritual circle. In the previous life, after she succeeded in practicing and stepped into the martial arts circle, she was fortunate to follow a figure of the evil circle to the spiritual circle and witnessed the whole process of the medicine emperor refining the life pill. The relationship between Yarrow Huang and that person wasn't shallow, and he didn't hide anything from her, allowing her to secretly memorize the process of concocting the pill. Although she had never obtained the Mount Chi Sky Lotus in her past life and had never tried to concoct the life-continuing Dan, with her attainments in pill concoction, as long as she recalled the process, it wouldn't be a problem for her to concoct the life-continuing Dan. Su Li's eyes flashed slightly. Qi Xianqing was about to die. How could she not see it? She just didn't say it. She owed Qi Xianqing a lot of favors. The second half of the Ghost Valley meditation direction couldn't pay it off. Although she didn't know how Qi Xianqing could escape the limit of heaven and earth in the previous life, in this life, she would prolong Qi Xianqing's life. Just when Su Li was lost in deep thought, the price of the Chishan Lotus had risen to 190 million taels of gold. Every time, there was a long interval before someone continued to raise the price. Yunyi hesitated and looked at Su Li. Su Li smiled slightly and pointed to the lotus on the tray, "Get it at all cost." Yunyi's expression became firm. He turned his head and said, 200 million taels of gold. Wow! This was the first treasure in today's auction whose price exceeded 200 million taels of gold. How could it not be shocking? Princess Li is really bold. Let's quit. Someone said in a gloomy tone with bad intentions, "I'm afraid that Princess Li has the money to buy the treasure, but she doesn't have the fortune to enjoy it." Someone took the lead, and immediately there was a burst of laughter in the field. Yunyi immediately looked worried. "Miss, after the auction, there will be a chaotic battle. Why don't we leave in advance?" "No, I want to see who will get the last auction item." Su Li seemed to rely on the power of the Dongfang family. She was not afraid at all and refused without hesitation. Yunyi could only sigh. When the supervisor of the auction came to trade, he left quietly to arrange people. No matter who got the full moon and heartstrings, the whole auction would be in chaos. At that time, there would be countless people who would fish in troubled waters. The miss with the Chishan lotus was like a big red lantern in the dark. She would be the target of public criticism, just like the force who got the full moon and heartstrings. However, no matter how powerful the enemy was, he would try his best to protect the miss. After a short commotion in the auction venue, as a young girl walked to the high platform with a tray covered with a red cloth, the whole venue was silent for a moment, and the tense atmosphere began to spread. Eunuch Feng smiled, as if he didn't notice that the atmosphere was getting tense. However, there were two cold-faced middle-aged men on both sides of him. The indifference in their eyes made the warriors in the field change their complexion slightly, and they couldn't breathe well. Some warriors with low cultivation couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood, and they looked terrified. Warriors at the peak of the inborn realm, and there were two of them at the same time. The royal family is really powerful. The arrogant and coquettish young man of the Hehuan sect also put away his contempt and admitted the overlord strength of the Dongfang family. The rest of the small sects who didn't know the immensity of the sky and the earth trembled with fear and reconsidered the previous threats. Anyway, Su Li had the blood of the Dongfang family in her body. If they hurt her, would it cause the anger of the Dongfang family? Many people thought of this, and the coldness in their eyes was restrained. Even the Dongfang family, who sent warriors to deter the forces in the martial arts circle, didn't expect that this move actually helped to relieve a lot of pressure on Su Li. The last auction item must have been waiting for a long time. I won't say much. Eunuch Feng lifted the red cloth neatly. There was a transparent glass bottle on the golden plate, in which an elixir with a cold color like moonlight lay quietly. The breathing in the hall immediately became heavier, and all the hot eyes were focused on the elixir. Ling Li held his breath slightly, but he didn't look at the full moon and heartstrings, but the young girl. He looked slightly gloomy and asked, "Is that one of us?" Ling Qinglan looked slightly pale and said, "No, it seems that the Dongfang family has found it." Ling Xian, who stood behind the two, looked down with her eyes gloomy. How could she let Su Li get what she wanted? This is the authentic full moon and heartstrings. Any female warrior, as long as she takes this elixir, the full moon immortal mansion will take root in the pubic region and be born by itself. Then she will become a rare talented warrior with unparalleled fighting power. Eunuch Feng's tone became excited and said, "This is a spiritual object of nature. Now, the bidding starts. The base price, none." Chapter 225. Silence. It was weird silence. After Eunuch Feng finished his words, there was no sound for a long time. The auction house fell into silence for the first time. Eunuch Feng was not in a hurry and still smiled. He knew that the silence would not last for a long time. The Lianxia cult bids 500 million taels of gold. His words were shocking. Many warriors sitting in the inquiring room were horrified. The people of the Lianxia cult were all cruel and merciless. They killed innocent people indiscriminately. In the territory of the Dahan country, they even reported their names to participate in the auction. Ha ha ha, Elder Dao, you are so bold. In this case, I can't hide it. 600 million taels of gold. A petrifying laughter resounded throughout the auction house, causing many martial artists to have goosebumps all over their bodies. This was not because of anything else, but because this laughter belonged to a man. Dao Zisang's face trembled and he was afraid. He said, "It turns out to be the deputy hierarch Hua of the Hehuan sect. Hierarch Yi has paid a lot for the full moon and heartstrings." Not at all, not at all. Elder Dao's wisdom is unparalleled. At that time, you must give in to this servant. The coquettish young man's voice was not sharp, but he pretended to be a weak woman's voice. Dao Zisang almost vomited. He could barely cope with it. At this time, Wei Yuran and Tan Tai Yu couldn't help but bid one after another. The Wei family of Nanjiang country bids 700 million taels of gold. The Tan Tai family of Tianji country bids 800 million taels of gold. The voices came from the 2 VIP rooms almost at the same time. Then they looked at the VIP room where the voices came from. Wei Yuran looked indifferent and looked at Tan Tai Yu's room coldly. In the secret competition with Dongfang Xiao, he lost to Tan Tai Yu and had been brooding about it. In addition to his sister's martial arts, no one in the Nanjiang country could surpass him in stratagem or anything else. Tan Tai Yu must die. Suddenly, a surly and evil voice came from all directions in the auction house. The 2 warriors at the peak of the inborn realm standing on the edge of the high platform changed their expressions slightly and subconsciously approached Eunuch Feng. They couldn't tell where the voice came from. It's so lively. The Enmore cult can't be absent. Dao Zisang and the deputy hierarch Hua changed their expressions almost at the same time. The voice was, the hierarch of the Enmore cult, Child Li. Child Li. The cult leader of the devil cult is here. Is the hierarch of the devil cult actually a woman? Otherwise, why would she come to snatch the full moon and heartstrings? Nonsense. I heard that there is a saintess in the Enmore cult, so I need the full moon and heartstrings. It's terrifying. I can foresee a heaven-shaking battle. I'll leave immediately after the auction. If I get caught up in it, I won't even know how I died. Many martial artists were horrified. Some even had the intention to retreat and quietly left the scene. In the VIP room number 22, Tan Tai Yu and Qi Xianqing looked serious. I didn't expect that the small full moon and heartstrings could gather the 3 superpowers in the martial arts circle. Qi Xianqing sighed slightly, and his eyes became sharper. It seems that I have to do something. Tan Tai Yu grasped the tactical matrix in his hand tightly. The master knew that he couldn't do it, but he still did it. What was the special effect of the full moon and heartstrings on junior sister apprentice? Dao Zisang's heart was beating fast. He couldn't help but stand up and bow to the void from a distance. Hierarch Li, you are a senior in cultivation. Why do you make life difficult for us juniors for the full moon and heartstrings? Yes. The coquettish young man said immediately. He actually echoed Dao Zisang's words and said nervously, Hierarch Li, you are distinguished. Today's auction is just a small scale. Why bother you to come here in person? The 2 elders spoke at the same time, and many martial artists were shocked on the spot. In their minds, the Enmore cult, the Hehuan sect and the Lianxia cult were at the same level. Why did the Enmore cult become the leader of the 3 superpowers? Dao Zisang's legs and stomach were trembling at the moment. The Enmore cult had always been secretive, but he was lucky to see Child Li fight in person. He split the enemy in the inborn 9th hurdle into 2 halves with only 1 palm. It was really terrible. Although the coquettish young man didn't see Ling Li fight, he was told by Yi Tian that if he came to Yunjing and met Child Li, he must not be his enemy. Otherwise, he would lose his life in vain. Hierarch Li was such a proud person, but he showed fear in front of Child Li, which impressed him deeply. The slightly hoarse laughter echoed again. Child Li continued to say, you don't need to be so restrained. I don't care about the full moon and heartstrings. However, the Dahan country is my territory. Since you are here, how can I not do my best as a host? Dao Zisang and Dao Zisang were relieved when they heard Child Li's words. But the latter words made them feel nervous at the same time. They felt cold all over. At this moment, the middle-aged man in black who was sitting quietly on the top floor of the back hall of the auction house suddenly opened his eyes with a strange expression. It's strange that I can't find the trace of Child Li with my unique psychic awareness. It seems that this person is really a strong enemy, as the head said. Hearing that Child Li said that the Dahan country was his territory, the middle-aged man in black looked gloomy. Child Li obviously didn't care about the Dongfang family. It was outrageous. Even I can't find the trace of him. It seems that even if the devil is not in the longevity realm, he is not an ordinary person at the peak of the inborn realm. If I report it to the head, I will gain something. The middle-aged man's murmur gradually became lower. His task was not only the Enmore cult. Since he couldn't find the trace of Child Li, he would make more efforts on other forces. His eyes flashed. The Hehuan sect and the Lianxia cult dare to covet the territory of the Dongfang family. They don't know what is good for them. The bidding in the hall was still going on. Except for the Hehuan sect, the Lianxia cult and the princes of the two countries who dared to bid, the other forces were also trembling with fear and didn't dare to bid. Now the full moon and heartstrings in Eunuch Feng's hand was a hot potato. They didn't want to lose their lives in the Dahan country without knowing the reason. 5 billion taels of gold. Tan Tai Yu said a shocking number with no expression. It was the income that many small countries couldn't get for 10 years. Wei Yuran sneered and said, "It's boring to continue bidding with gold. The full moon and heartstrings can't be measured by money. Why don't we use the rules of the martial arts circle to decide the bidding price?" Dao Zisang's eyes flashed and he said with a smile, "Child Wei's words are very reasonable. The Lianxia cult offers 10 martial arts stones and 50 middle-grade elixirs. If there is a higher price, the Lianxia cult will withdraw from this competition." As soon as the words came out, Wei Yuran's face immediately became gloomy. He was not the only one who was prepared. Compared with the Lianxia cult, which had a profound foundation, the 3 martial arts stones he collected seemed to be too inferior. Brother, Wei Zhenzhen was worried. It seemed that she couldn't get the full moon and heartstrings immediately. Chapter 226. Eunuch Feng's eyes flashed when he heard the words Martial Dao Stone. He nodded repeatedly and said, "The Lianxia cult is the most valuable one. Is there anyone else bidding?" Martial Dao Stone was a rare treasure in the martial arts circle. It was a spiritual stone that recorded the sentiments of the ancestors. After refining, it could greatly activate the thinking of warriors and improve their understanding. It could improve the efficiency of practicing any martial arts skills. It was an extremely powerful treasure that could save time for practice. Dao Zisang took out 10 of them at once, which showed that the Lianxia cult had a lot of resources. "Elder Dao, you are so bold. The Hehuan sect withdraws. Tianji country, withdraws." The coquettish young man squinted his eyes and joked. A voice also came from the VIP room number 22. The Enmore cult didn't say anything after they said that. 3 of the 4 forces withdrew. No one expected that the owner of the full moon and heartstrings would be born in this way. Eunuch Feng was stunned and immediately announced loudly, "Congratulations to the Lianxia cult for winning the last treasure of this auction, the full moon and heartstring." The hall was silent for a moment, and then burst into a tide-like uproar. "Elder, the full moon and heartstrings is ours." Dao Zisang was surprised and trembling. He understood the thoughts of other forces. They obviously wanted to get something for nothing. However, he was prepared for it and didn't panic. After the steward brought the full moon and heartstrings and finished the transaction, Dao Zisang glanced at all the elders in the VIP room and said in a low voice, "Everyone, act according to the original plan. Let's go." Without another word, everyone immediately left through the specially arranged passageway of the auction house. The corpse puppets that had been lying dormant outside the auction house began to move, killing all the martial artists who hadn't had the time to escape along the way and all the people who saw them. For a moment, blood splashed into the sky and screams were heard constantly. Dao Zisang's eyes were gloomy. Before leaving the auction house, he suddenly handed the glass bottle to a short and thin elder with a protruding mouth and monkey cheeks. He secretly transmitted the sound, "Fourth elder, your Qinggong is the best and your realm of disguise is profound. You take this thing back to the sect immediately. No mistake." The short and skinny old man opened his mouth wide in shock. This was different from what they had agreed on before. However, he quickly reacted and hid the glass bottle. He nodded solemnly and left. The secret tunnel of the auction house led to the outside of the city, which was known by many people. From the moment the auction ended, countless warriors and forces lurking outside the city stared at the exit, waiting for Dao Zisang and others to come out. Rumble, rumble, rumble. Some martial artists put their ears to the ground and their eyes lit up. "Here it comes." Roar. Countless corpse puppets rushed out like a flood, and it was hard to tell how many real people were among them. Before anyone could react, these corpse puppets split into 3 and fled in 3 different directions. "Damn it, which one should I chase? Whatever, let's try our luck." Time was pressing, so the warriors didn't have time to think carefully. They all chased in the direction that they thought was right. A considerable number of warriors with low cultivation didn't chase after them. Instead, they started to fight with their targets as soon as they got out of the auction house. The full moon and heartstrings was not the only treasure sold in the auction house. There were shouts of killing outside, but Su Li was still sitting in the VIP room of the auction house with an indifferent look. Yun Yi came in from outside and said in a low voice with a dignified face, "Miss, it has been arranged. We will escort you back now." A ray of light flashed through Su Li's eyes. She didn't get up but asked aloud, "Yun Yi, who is your master?" Yun Yi didn't understand and said in astonishment, "Miss, of course." Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly and said in a more and more strange tone, "Will you listen to any of my orders?" "Of course." Yun Yi knelt down and lowered his head. "The 10 guards of the Yunj sect will go through fire and water for you in this life. Heaven and earth can prove it. Then I want you to commit suicide. Show me which one you want." Su Li's voice suddenly became cold. Yun Yi's pupils contracted violently and he looked up unbelievably. He was shocked to see that Su Li was serious and serious. Was the woman in front of him really the miss who usually took care of them? "What? Are you just saying that you'll do whatever you want?" Su Li picked her nails and her eyes were full of sarcasm. She said disdainfully, "Sure enough, they are all lies. My father raised a group of ungrateful people and even gave you to me as a treasure. How stupid they are." As soon as this remark came out, Yun Yi's face turned pale. The shock in his heart immediately turned into anger and then into sadness. Did their master always think of them like this? Was such a miss really worthy of their following? Yun Yi's breath was slightly rapid, and then he suddenly took a deep breath. His face became cold again. He half knelt on the ground and straightened his body. He said in a flat tone, "Your Grace, you are wrong. My life belongs to you. Since you have an order, I will commit suicide now. This life was given by Lord Rui's mansion. Today I will give it back to you." Yun Yi closed his eyes and suddenly pulled out his long sword without saying a word. He cut his neck fiercely. Ding! A light sound reverberated in Yun Yi's ears. Then a great force came from the sword and directly knocked the long sword in his hand away. Yun Yi opened his eyes in shock. What he saw was the familiar gentle smile of the miss. "I was just joking. You took it seriously." Yun Yi stood up in surprise and doubt. Just now he was full of grief and tried to commit suicide with all his strength. How did the miss, who was not even a warrior of the inborn realm, stop him? When Yun Yi was full of doubts, Su Li clapped her hands and said inexplicably, "Come in." The door of the VIP room was pushed open silently. Fang Yuan and others, who had been disguised by Wen Tingshan, filed in, followed by Yun to Yun She. They all looked a little surprised and scared. They looked at Su Li as if they were looking at a stranger. Everyone passed. This group of people is very loyal and more determined than the 20 people who trained in the secluded site. Fang Yuan stood beside Su Li and secretly transmitted the sound. Su Li nodded slightly. She knew the loyalty of these 10 people in her previous life. Now it was just a small test. The rest were handed over to Fang Yuan and others, and she personally came to deal with Yun Yi. "Miss, what's going on?" Yun Yi finally couldn't help asking. He didn't know a considerable number of people who came in. Su Li smiled slightly and patted Yun Yi on the shoulder. "You will know soon." Now, Su Li's eyes were cold. Start. As soon as she finished speaking, several people who were originally wrapped in black robes showed their true faces. They were exactly the same as Su Li. Even their clothes were the same as Su Li's. Yun Yi and others were stunned. If they didn't know which one was the real miss before, they couldn't distinguish it at all. It turns out that the miss has been prepared. Yun Yi came to his senses. Just now, Miss was testing his loyalty. Next, everyone put on bamboo hats according to Su Li's instructions. A group of more than 30 people went out of the auction house together. 4 teams were divided from them and escorted the fake Su Li away. The warriors who had been lurking in the dark waiting for Su Li were stunned when they saw so many people in bamboo hats in the same clothes. Then they could only choose one to catch up with. The Lord Rui's mansion is really cunning. They even use the way of the Lianxia cult to leave. We have no chance to win against the royal guards. If we go deep into Yunjing City, our lives will be in danger. Forget it. I don't want the Chishan Lotus. Let's go. Let's go after the Lianxia cult. Under such a plan, many people immediately retreated and turned to chase the people of the Lianxia cult. At this moment, the real Su Li was in cyan clothes and wore a bamboo hat. She changed into the appearance of Mr. Li. In addition to Yun Sai, Yun Qi, and Yun Ju who went to distract the attention, Yun Yi and others were also disguised by Wen Tingshan and followed Su Li out of the city. The appearance of such a large group of inborn seniors immediately made many warriors who were fighting outside the city retreat. They all guessed which force had left the city until now. The young man beside Chu Lu is quite difficult to deal with. If we can't get away, how can we chase the people of the Lianxia cult? Su Li smiled and said, "Come with me." Then she took the lead to fly to the waterside pavilion in the south of the city. Her speed was as fast as lightning. Fang Yuan and others were not surprised and immediately followed her. Yun Yi and others were dumbfounded. It turned out that the miss had been an inborn senior for a long time. A 17-year-old warrior of the inborn realm, young. Master. Yuna trembled and said. Then he followed her excitedly. It was a great blessing to follow the young master in this life. Follow her. Don't let the master down. Yun Yi's gaze was profound. Only he knew that the young Mrs. Cultivation was absolutely not as simple as the young supremacy stage. She was able to block a full-force strike from a congenital fourth-stage expert with a single finger. That level of cultivation had already surpassed his imagination. On the other side, Tan Tai Yu controlled the tactical matrix. A machine-operated eagle was overlooking the ground above Yunjing City. It clearly saw the escape of the Lianxia cult. The eagle's eyesight was so strong that it could see the prey hiding in the grass even if it flew in a very high sky. This mechanism was the secret treasure of Tianji country. It was much more powerful than ordinary eagles. The little movements of every group of people of the Lianxia cult were recorded and reflected in Tan Tai Yu's mind. Well, one person left alone and blended into the ordinary warriors. He fled to the south. This person is not any elder of the Lianxia cult. However, the disguise skill. Tan Tai Yu suddenly opened his eyes and said, "There is a result." Qi Xianqing's turbid eyes were full of brilliance. He said, "Take everyone and let's chase them." Just at this moment, a charming smile appeared behind Tan Tai Yu. "Prince of Tianji country, can you give me a ride?" Tan Tai Yu was also an inborn senior. His reaction was very sharp. He immediately retreated and saw the person behind him. Sure enough, it was the people of the Hehuan sect. There were dozens of inborn seniors. Chu Lu was also among them. Her face was very pale. She was forced to come here by the coquettish young man. She was trapped. Tan Tai Yu looked slightly cold. Looking at the people of the Hehuan sect who surrounded them, he was not flustered. Qi Xianqing stood out and said slowly, "Hua Rui, I don't want to be enemies with you. Get out of the way quickly." The coquettish young man was called by his real name. He looked at Qi Xianqing up and down with his bloody eyes. Then he said with a faint smile, "Forgive me. Who are you?" Chapter 227. Deputy Hierarch Hua, why did the Lianxia cult run away without notifying me? Do you also want to leave in a hurry? Hua Rui's smile froze on his face. He slowly turned around and saw Ling Li wearing a jadebone mask and the masters of the Enmore cult who were twice as many as them. His heart suddenly thumped and his face became gloomy. "Child Li, I respect you as a senior. I don't think I have done anything beyond the rules of your cult. Do you want to kill us for no reason?" At the same time, Hua Rui secretly ordered everyone to gather together to fight against the Enmore cult. Tan Tai Yu and Qi Xianqing got out of trouble and stood aside bitterly. He had no chance to win against either of the two big sects. Today, he was caught in the middle. Tianji country was good at the mechanism secret technique, and it sat on the throne of a country because of the mechanism secret technique. It was absolutely the best country in the world in terms of defense against foreign enemies, but in terms of fighting with others, it had too many disadvantages, which was also the reason why Tianji country never competed for foreign things. When you find a gap, run as far as you can. Although my fighting power is not strong, I am at the peak of the inborn realm. It won't be too dangerous. Tantai suddenly received the sound transmitted by Enchanting. He was shocked and asked, "What about the full moon and heartstrings of junior sister apprentice?" "Silly boy. You can get the treasure again. But you will lose everything if you die. Do you really think that I only care about your junior sister apprentice's practice and ignore your life?" Tantai smiled when he was scolded by Enchanting. He said, "I know, master. I will act according to circumstances." Enchanting secretly breathed a sigh of relief. His wrinkled face was dignified. Only Hua Rui in the Hehuan sect had the same cultivation as him, but there were too many people in the Enmore cult who he couldn't see through. It was difficult for you to escape. But at this time, Ling Li's strange voice came from under the jadebone mask. "Miss Chu Lu beside you has been dormant in the capital for many years. If she had done something out of line, I would have destroyed the Hongyang pavilion. For no reason at all. Is Vice Sect Master Hua joking?" Chu Lu stopped breathing and scolded Hua Rui in her heart. Except that she was discovered by Mr. Li, her identity had been well hidden. Otherwise, with the overbearing behavior of the Enmore cult, they would have put their previous words into action. If Hua Rui didn't force her to come here, how could she be exposed? However, I have compassion in my heart. How could I possibly do something that goes against reason and nature? What Ling Li said made Hua Rui relieved, and then he became nervous. "It's impolite of the Lianxia cult to leave without telling us. How about the little prince of Tianji country lead the way? If you can find the Lianxia cult, the Enmore cult will reward you." As soon as the words came out, everyone looked at Tantai. The pressure was like a tide, and Tantai's calm face was a little pale. Enchanting snorted and stood in front of Tantai to release the oppression. He stared at Ling Li and said, "Child Li, you can lead the way, but you must ensure that my apprentice is not in danger. Otherwise, you will never get the full moon and heartstrings." As soon as Enchanting said this, Hua Rui was scared. He knew that Child Li hated being threatened the most. Sure enough, the next moment, Ling Li suddenly stretched out his hand and grabbed Enchanting fiercely. Boom! A strong suction broke out from his palm. Enchanting was horrified to find that his ability to move was imprisoned in an instant, and he had no power to break free. He could only watch his neck being pinched by Ling Li master. Tantai's face changed greatly. He didn't expect that Ling Li would take action without saying anything. "What I hate most in my life is that someone threatens me." Ling Li looked at Enchanting with his evil eyes, and golden light appeared in his eyes. Enchanting immediately felt that his face was hot, as if it was penetrated by magma. "It turns out to be you." Hearing Ling Li's words, Enchanting was extremely shocked. His disguise was actually broken. Seeing that the old man at the peak of the inborn realm fell into Ling Li's hands without resistance, Hua Rui suddenly felt cold and didn't dare to move. All the people behind him also showed fear and didn't dare to breathe loudly. "Let go, my master." Tantai stared at the pressure, and his blood almost froze, but he still struggled to speak. He tried to maintain a calm tone. "I will take you to the Lianxia cult. You can do whatever you want, but you let go of my master. This is a deal, not a threat." Enchanting gave up struggling and sighed in his heart. Silly boy, this was the devil Child Li. The Enmore cult and the Dongfang family had always been incompatible. He used to be the teacher of Dongfang Xiao. Although he and Dongfang Xiao had already broken off relations, even if he explained, would the devil listen to him? Suddenly, he felt that his neck was loosened. The sharp genuine energy drilled into his body like a silk thread and sealed his cultivation. Instantly, Enchanting temporarily became an ordinary person. Enchanting was stunned. Child Li actually let him go. Ling Li showed some appreciation in his eyes and said with interest, "Interesting. Boy of the Tantai family, I will agree with your request. But if you can't find the whereabouts of the full moon and heartstrings, don't blame me for being cruel." Tantai was happy when he heard that, and then he felt great pressure. In fact, he was not sure whether the man really had the full moon and heartstrings, but now, he could only gamble. I know the direction, but, Tantaiyu said and glanced at the people of the Hehuan sect. Hua Rui immediately trembled and retreated to the edge. He said respectfully, if Hierarch Li is willing to let me go today, the people of the Hehuan sect will never step into Yunjing City in the future. What answered him was a horrible palm. Bang! Hua Rui looked up and spat blood. He was beaten dozens of feet away, but Hua Rui didn't know who did it. At this moment, his heart was trembling. He couldn't wait to go back to the headquarters of the Hehuan sect immediately. The Enmore cult couldn't be defeated. I never believe in the sweet words of the Hehuan sect. Ling Li's eyes were dull and cold. Qi Xianqing couldn't help but tremble. How many people did he kill to condense such a horrible killing intent? Go away. Today, time is tight. I will let you go. If you are still in Yunjing City when I come back, don't blame me for not giving face to Hierarch Yi Tian. Yes. Hua Rui got up quickly and immediately left with his servants. He wished that his parents could give him 2 more legs. Chu Lu managed to keep up with them, but she was worried in her heart. If she left like this, the people of the Hongyang house would suffer. How could she explain it to Mr. Li? Seeing the people of the Hehuan sect escape, Tantaiyu was surprised. It seemed that the notorious child Li in the martial arts circle was not as bloodthirsty as imagined. But he soon attributed the reason to the time. Tantaiyu closed his eyes to contact the machine-operated eagle. When he saw the picture from the machine-operated eagle, he immediately said, "There is a beautiful building in the south of the city. The people of the Lianxia cult are hiding there. The waterside pavilion in the south of the city." He reached out and grabbed Tantaiyu's shoulder. Then he rushed out like lightning. Ling Mo grabbed Qi Xianqing behind him. Everyone immediately followed. Whoosh, the strong wind blew on his face. Tantaiyu's hair stood up and he couldn't open his eyes. But he still saw the hand that grabbed his shoulder. It was white and slender. It was like the hand of a teenager. This was an impression in his mind. Tantaiyu was slightly shocked. Wasn't the hierarch of the Enmore cult an old monster who had lived for hundreds of years and his cultivation was unknown? Had he returned to his youth and stepped into an unknown realm? Tantaiyu was terrified and didn't dare to guess again. But he didn't know that Ling Li also had difficulties at this moment. If the plan didn't go wrong and the time was tight, he couldn't directly expose himself to find the full moon and heartstrings. The Dongfang family must be observing in the dark. Ling Li's eyes flashed with cold light. Only by killing them could the secret of the Enmore cult be kept. The legend known by the world was not false. The original hierarch of the Enmore cult was indeed an old monster who had lived for more than 300 years. Ling Li didn't know why the old monster passed the position of hierarch to him before he died. Although the cult was flourishing in recent years, and those elders with terrible cultivation didn't come out to make trouble, Ling Li always felt that the situation was out of control. All of this was the uneasiness brought by the lack of strength. He knew that only when he broke through to the longevity realm and his fighting power could he become the real master of the Enmore cult. In the eyes of those old monsters, his actions might be just a small fight. If he died, the Enmore cult would be dormant and wait for the next master. Because the hierarch of the Enmore cult was dead, it was impossible for the Enmore cult to take revenge with the whole sect. At this moment, Su Li suddenly stopped in the middle of the chase. Fang Yuan, Yun Yi, and others were all confused and asked. Su Li shook her head. She sensed that the person with the full moon and heartstrings was in the waterside pavilion in the south of the city. His breath was vague and dormant. He was waiting for other people of the Lianxia cult to gather. Then it was not urgent. Su Li suddenly turned around and looked into the distance behind her. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Someone is coming. After a few seconds, Fang Yuan and others sensed it and were not nervous. Yun Yi and others were nervous. Although they were all inborn seniors, none of them was at the peak of the inborn realm. If they met any of the 4 forces who had bid before, they would die miserably. As this thought flashed through Yun Yi's mind, he widened his eyes and looked over. He saw a person wearing a jade bone mask and holding a pale young man in his hand. Jade bone mask. Child Li of the Enmore cult. It was over. Yun Yi almost fainted. What he was afraid of really happened, and the most powerful one came. Although they were frightened, Yun Yi and others subconsciously stood in front of Su Li. Fang Yuan and others were amused and moved. Whoosh! Ling Li stopped when the wind swept by. His clothes were fluttering. Ling Mo, Ling Qinglan, and others came behind him. When he saw the young man in cyan with a bamboo hat, he was slightly stunned. He came here with the help of Tan Tai Yu. Mr. Li was more well-informed than him. When Ling Qinglan and others saw Su Li, their tense faces eased and they all held their fists. Such a reaction instantly caused Yun Yi to be extremely shocked. Chapter 228. Ling Li was concerned about the full moon and heartstrings. He confronted Su Li for a moment and finally couldn't help but break the silence. Didn't you say that you would run the winery honestly and don't care about external affairs? Are you also interested in the full moon and heartstrings? Master? Which one? Yun Yi and others were confused. Who among them could make the hierarch of the Enmore cult so afraid? Haha, Su Li gave a clear laugh under the bamboo hat. Hierarch, you are wrong. It's rare for a treasure like the full moon and heartstrings to appear in the secular world. If I don't come to see it, wouldn't my life be too boring? Ling Li was silent for a moment and said slowly, Mr. Li, the full moon and heartstrings is very useful to me. If you just want to see what the full moon and heartstrings looks like, I can lend it to you for 3 days after I get it. Please don't do anything this time. I owe you a favor. Looking at Su Li, who suddenly changed her voice, Yun Yi and others were completely dumbfounded. The miss was the mysterious Mr. Li with a frightening background. Yun Yi and others were all stunned. They didn't dare to look back at Su Li. What they saw today was like a dream. It seemed so unreal. One was a weak princess who was born in the folk and had ordinary skills. The other was Mr. Li, who had excellent skills and martial arts. These two people were actually the same person. Yun Yi and others were shocked. Su Li narrowed her eyes and secretly transmitted the sound to Wen Tingshan. She said, I certainly know the purpose of your cult to get the full moon and heartstrings, but Ling Li thought of the relationship between Mr. Li and Su Li and felt uncomfortable. But when he heard that Mr. Li meant to retreat, he was a little relieved. But what? To be honest, Ling Li didn't have absolute confidence to win against Mr. Li. Although Mr. Li didn't do anything since he appeared, he always felt that he was very dangerous. It seemed that there was an extremely dangerous force in his body, which made Ling Li afraid. Just when Ling Li finished his words, Su Li suddenly narrowed her eyes and secretly transmitted the sound to Wen Tingshan, don't wait. Do it. Bang, 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 bang. A terrible pneuma like a tsunami suddenly appeared. Ling Li's expression changed instantly. Ling Qinglan threw out his folding fan without saying anything. It turned into a protective tactical matrix and covered everyone in it. After this step, several black shadows fell from the sky like dumplings. They fell onto the protective barrier of the town and rolled to the ground, unable to move. This, seeing that more than a dozen people in black suddenly appeared in the field, except for Su Li and the people of the Linli building who knew about it, everyone else was stunned. Whoosh! A very light grey shadow flashed, and Wen Tingshan appeared in front of Su Li. Yun Yi and others were so scared that their hearts almost stopped and their blood coagulated. Where did this terrifying figure come from? They didn't even notice how this person appeared. Only Ling Li saw the movement of this person. He also came down from above and finally stood in front of Su Li. In that case, Ling Li seemed to think of something. He looked at the man in black who couldn't move on the ground and narrowed his eyes slowly. When Tingshan pretended to salute to Su Li and secretly transmitted the sound, one of them is in the half-step to the longevity realm. I have marked him. I see. You go to the waterside pavilion in the south of the city first. Don't let the people of the Lianxia cult escape. When Tingshan nodded and disappeared in front of everyone. When Tingshan left, but the atmosphere in the field was not relaxed. Ling Mo and others were really shocked. But Ling Qinglan remembered that this person was the senior he saw in the Linli building last time. A senior in the longevity realm. Ling Li waved his hand to let Ling Qinglan withdraw the protective tactical matrix. He walked to the man in black who lay on the ground motionless. He squatted down and reached out to remove the mask on his face, revealing his face. He didn't know this person, but he could guess the identity of this person. The middle-aged man in black was stiff and could only move his eyes. He looked at the jadebone mask and the bamboo hat and cyan clothes not far away. He was frightened. They were sent by Dongfang Xiao to inquire about information. Naturally, they were extraordinary. In terms of hiding ability, even a senior in the longevity realm couldn't compare with them. Moreover, he himself had already stepped into the longevity realm. Even a senior in the longevity realm with high strength couldn't necessarily find him. But this time, he didn't see the figure at all. He only felt that it was dark in front of him. Then his cultivation was restrained and he was thrown down from the tree in the sky. It was horrible. There was such a horrible person in the Linli building. This matter must be reported to the head of the family. Thinking of this, the middle-aged man in black was full of bitterness. He had become a fish on the chopping board. It was unknown whether he could go back alive. I don't like people eavesdropping when I talk in my life. Su Li walked slowly and said in a light tone. But the middle-aged man in black heard it very coldly. Tell me, you little mice, who are hiding in the dark. Which force do you come from? What do you want? The middle-aged man in black was so angry that he twisted his mouth. This person knew that his tendons and vessels were sealed and he couldn't speak or transmit the sound, but he still asked him like this. Ling Li stood up and saluted to Su Li. He said in a low voice with some sincerity, "Thank you very much." Needless to say, with Mr. Li's wisdom, he must understand why he thanked him. Su Li nodded slightly and transmitted the sound, "Hierarch Ling, this group of people must be troublesome for you. Why don't you let me deal with them?" Ling Li frowned slightly and transmitted the sound, "It is impossible that you don't know their origin." Su Li smiled indifferently, "I just asked them about their origin. Since they didn't tell me, how could I know? In this case, those who rashly disturb my peace will naturally be dealt with by me." Hearing such a fallacy, Ling Li couldn't find a way to refute. He smiled bitterly and transmitted the sound back, "They were found by you, so naturally, you can deal with them. We, the Enmore cult, will not intervene in this matter." Su Li nodded and ordered someone to find a carriage. She threw the people of the Dongfang family into the carriage and transported them back to the Linli building. The auction fair was a grand event. 4 forces came here. The Dongfang family would definitely observe secretly and be a bystander. Neither the Linli building nor the Enmore cult should be exposed. So, she had already asked Wen Tingshan to look for traces of the Dongfang family around. As expected, most of the spies of the Dongfang family followed Ling Li. This time, Ling Li's action was really full of loopholes. According to his previous actions, it shouldn't be like this. Su Li had doubts in her heart, but she couldn't ask directly. She could only take people with Ling Li to the waterside pavilion in the south of the city. In a stable of the waterside pavilion, the 4th elder of the Lianxia cult hid in the dark. He restrained his pneuma and quietly waited for the arrival of other people of the Lianxia cult. This was the place agreed by Dao Zisang. The 3rd prince also arranged the waterside pavilion and temporarily withdrew the servants. Elder Dao changed the plan temporarily. As expected, no one followed him here. The full moon and heartstrings belonged to the Lianxia cult. The 4th elder's triangular eyes flashed with excitement. He took out the glass bottle from his bosom and carefully examined it. Suddenly, his expression changed slightly. He approached the glass bottle and sniffed it carefully. It was a very light fragrance. If it wasn't for the fact that he was huddled in a corner and looking at it, he wouldn't have noticed it at all. The glaze bottle was tampered with. Run. There was only one word left in the 4th elder's heart. He stood up and rushed out without saying a word. Suddenly, he blacked out and fell to the ground. The glaze bottle also fell to the ground and rolled to a person's feet. Wen Tingshan picked up the glaze bottle and handed it to Su Li silently. In the night, Ling Li could see that there was no fluctuation in his eyes. What a loyal subordinate. Ling Li praised secretly. His psychic awareness swept outside the waterside pavilion from time to time. According to Su Li's proposal, only Su Li, Ling Li, and Wen Tingshan entered the waterside pavilion. Although Ling Li was afraid to face such a horrible person like Wen Tingshan, he still chose to believe Su Li because of the previous spy of the Dongfang family. Su Li shook the glaze bottle and chuckled. Then she took out an identical elixir and glaze bottle from her arms and put them into the arms of the fourth elder. Wen Tingshan was surprised. Ling Li was even more surprised. But it was covered by the mask, so he didn't show it. Now he finally understood why Su Li didn't let a large number of people in. It turned out that she had a plan. Su Li threw the glaze bottle to Ling Li without saying anything. Ling Li put it away in a hurry. There was a hidden bitterness in his eyes. If it was broken, how could he explain it to Su Li? This elder of the Lianxia cult has practiced for many years. Isn't it a waste to die like this? Su Li opened the mouth of the fourth elder and gave him a bottle of medicine. Ling Li couldn't help but ask in confusion, "What did you give him?" When Tingshan snorted coldly, "Hierarch Ling, don't ask too much." He didn't have a good impression of the Enmore cult. When the Enmore cult was still in the spiritual circle, the Wandswords Mountain and the Enmore cult were incompatible. One was a decent example, the other was a devil. Later, the Enmore cult withdrew from the spiritual circle, so the hostility was eased a lot. Ling Li suddenly felt cold all over, as if he was stared at by a beast. His eyes flashed with coldness. Before he refuted, he heard Su Li's slightly reprimanding voice. "Protector Shan, Hierarch Ling is a distinguished guest of the Linli building. Don't be rude." When Tingshan narrowed his eyes, Ling Li felt cold all over. He even had the illusion that he would fight in the next breath. But in the end, he just snorted coldly and turned his head. Ling Li breathed a sigh of relief. He didn't understand why the subordinates of the Linli building were hostile to him, but he couldn't ask directly. "Let's go." A hand gently patted him on the shoulder. Ling Li came to his sense. He glanced at Wen Tingshan, who followed Su Li honestly and followed them. In the middle of the night, the cold wind blew. The war in Yunjing City hadn't been extinguished yet. Shouts could be heard everywhere. The two people who really got the full moon and heartstrings were idle at this moment. Su Li and Ling Li repulsed the subordinates of the two sides respectively. They strolled in the forest and talked alone. "Aren't you curious about what I gave him to drink? That's my unique poison. He won't remember that he was beaten or that the glass bottle was tampered with. He will only remember that he slept in the waterside pavilion in the south of the city." Su Li suddenly said. Ling Li's scalp was numb. His suspicion was true. Chapter 229. But Qi Xianqing only knew medicine, and he was not proficient in poison. Ling Li thought. At this time, Su Li, who was walking in front of him, suddenly stopped. He looked up and found that they were outside Yunjing City. "Hierarch Ling, see you later." Su Li simply left without any hesitation. Ling Li could only sigh and continue to hide his doubts in his heart. In the headquarters of Enmore cult, Qi Xianqing sat on the precious pear wood chair. He was expressionless, but his heart was trembling. One day, he could come to the legendary headquarters of the Enmore cult. Although his cultivation was blocked and his eyes were blindfolded, he didn't know where it was. But he knew that it was not too far from Yunjing City. Looking at the fragrant tea in his hand, Qi Xianqing felt that it was tasteless, and there was worry in his eyes. Knowing such a secret, could he and his apprentice leave safely? Perhaps Tan Tai Yu was not knowledgeable enough, or Ling Li's behavior was convincing, but he was much more open-minded than Qi Xianqing. He carried a long wooden box and looked around, but he didn't see any sign of mechanism. It was more like a slightly luxurious house than the headquarters of the Enmore cult. He wanted to go outside to have a look, but he was stopped. He had to give up helplessly. After a while, Ling Li came in with a jadebone mask. He chuckled and said, "You have been waiting for a long time. I have a few questions to ask you. If you are willing to cooperate, someone will send you away." What if he didn't answer? Qi Xianqing took a deep breath, but he didn't say what he thought. He nodded and said, Hierarch, you are distinguished. What you say is worth 1,000 gold. I will believe you once. Ask me. Ling Li laughed in his heart. The old guy even flattered him. He was really afraid. However, based on the relationship between him and Su Li, Ling Li couldn't kill him. Thinking of this, Ling Li turned his head and looked at Tan Tai Yu, who was still walking over and sitting down obediently. He said, Mr. Qi, what is the relationship between you and Dongfang Xiao? Qi Xianqing heard it and thought that there was such a question. The relationship between him and Dongfang Xiao had been broken, so there was no need to hide it. He immediately revealed a bitter smile and said, I had an agreement with the Dongfang family. I taught Dongfang Xiao to be an adult, and the Dongfang family had to do something for me. It was mutually beneficial. But later, I found that Dongfang Xiao was ungrateful and didn't want to help me at all. So, I cheated them. After that, I never set foot in Yunjing City again for decades. What I said is true. If there is any deception, I will be in Yunjing City. If so, are you satisfied with my answer? Xianqing looked at Ling Li and said. Ling Li nodded slightly and laughed in his heart. This old guy was a scoundrel. As soon as he saw that he suffered a loss, he immediately ran away. What is the relationship between Elder Qi and Tianji country? Ling Li narrowed his eyes under the mask. What the old guy said was not necessarily true. It was possible that he deliberately ignored many details. But he said what he wanted to know without missing a word, which was enough. Old Mr. Qi is really sensible. One last question. Ling Li praised. He stared at Mr. Qi and said slowly, I heard that Mr. Qi's medical skills are unparalleled and you are the first in the martial arts circle. How do you compare with Mr. Li? Qi Xianqing was stunned, and then he shook his head with a wry smile and said, Hierarch, you've stumped me. I just arrived in Yunjing City. Today, I heard Mr. Li's name at the auction fair. Then, I saw him for the first time. I don't know his medical skills. How can I know who is better between me and him? Li Yunhong said. Are you serious? Ling Li raised his eyebrows slightly and confirmed again. Qi Xianqing looked solemn and nodded. He was full of confidence. Everything I said is true. I dare not lie. If you know Mr. Li's address, you can go with me to confront him face to face. Forget it, I believe you. Ling Li shook his head. With the mysterious senior of the longevity realm, how could he go to Mr. Li's territory rashly? Moreover, Qi Xianqing's reaction was very natural when he saw Mr. Li or now. He didn't seem to be lying. After sending away Qi Xianqing and Tan Tai Yu, Ling Li was lost in thought. Since it was not Qi Xianqing, he had every reason to suspect that Su Li's poison skill was taught by Mr. Li. And, he heard from Su Li's early experience that she named herself. Now it seemed that it was Mr. Li who gave her the name. Was the relationship between them so close? When Ling Li thought of this, he was angry. It seemed that he was suffocated in his heart. He was very uncomfortable. Ling Mo. Master, I'm here. Ling Mo, dressed in black and gold, came in the door. He looked calm and said, everything is ready. I'll do it myself. I'll do it now. Seeing Ling Li go out without looking back, Ling Mo was inexplicable. Did the master take the wrong medicine today? Beside the official road outside the city, Ling Liuyi was hiding in the bushes. The expression on his face was almost the same as that of Ling Mo. He was cold-blooded and ruthless. Suddenly, there was a sound behind him. He suddenly looked back and saw Ling Mo. He was scared and said exaggeratedly, eldest brother, you didn't make a sound when you walked. I was almost scared out of my wits. You pay for it. The subordinates around wanted to laugh but dared not. Ling Liuyi was one of the deputy heads of the Sholu cult. Although he joined the force late, he was born to be a killer. He was promoted very quickly. He admired Ling Mo most. He liked to imitate Ling Mo's words and deeds when he had nothing to do. But he couldn't keep a straight face. It was easy to expose his cheerful temperament. Except for killing, he was very confused at other times. This was deeply liked by his subordinates. Ling Mo twitched his mouth and stepped aside. When Ling Liuyi saw the jadebone mask, he was so scared that he almost bit his tongue. He said with a sad face, "Hi, child." Seeing Ling Liuyi, Ling Li was a little less upset. He immediately smiled and said, "Liuyi, you still like to joke as before. You haven't changed at all. Do you still remember the rules of the cult?" "Yes." Ling Liuyi drooped his head. At other times, it was okay for him to stand on Ling Mo's head and make trouble. But now he was performing a task. He couldn't laugh and make trouble. Otherwise, he would be punished. "It's good that you remember. Remember to take the punishment later." "Yes." Ling Liuyi responded weakly. Suddenly, the smile on Ling Li's face faded. Ling Liuyi's ears moved. He lowered his body and looked out. Then he quickly recovered his calm face and forgot all the punishment. On the dark official road, a group of people appeared in the distance. It was Wei Yuran and Wei Zhenzhen who walked in the front. They finally came. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.